If you want a vision of the future, Winston, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever.
You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth!
Someone is trying to teach me a lesson in futility. Why am I the only one who isn't killed?
They will run you dizzy. They will pile falsehood on top of falsehood until you can't tell a lie from the truth, and you won't even want to. That's how the powerful keep their power. Don't you read the papers?
I just want to say one word to you. Just one word.
Yes, sir.
Are you listening?
Yes, I am.
Plastics.
I'm going to get your money for you. But if you don't get the President of the United States on that phone, you know what's going to happen to you?
What?
You're going to have to answer to the Coca-Cola Company.
The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business. The world is a business, Mr. Beale. It has been since man crawled out of the slime.
Welcome to another episode of Our Interesting Times. It is my pleasure to have Professor Richard Spence back on the show. Richard returns to discuss his book, Secret Agent 666, Aleister Crowley, British Intelligence, and the Occult. Richard Spence is a professor of European history at the University of Idaho with a focus on Russia and Eastern European studies in the 20th century. He is the author of several other books, including Wall Street and the Russian Revolution, 1905 to 1925, a book we discussed last time we talked. And, of course, Trust No One, The Secret World of Sidney Reilly. Richard, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. How are you, Tim?
Very well. Thank you for coming back on the show.
My pleasure.
So this book, Secret Agent 666, Aleister Crowley, British Intelligence, and the Occult. So, I read it. It was a very interesting book, a very, I think, dispassionate analysis of the career of this man and his influence and what role he played. And I appreciate that because, of course, the name Aleister Crowley conjures up all types of images and feelings, given his, his impact on popular culture and these things and what people say about him. So, your book was a great analysis. So, let's get into it. Aleister Crowley, who was he, and what function did he serve for British intelligence?
Well, it's a big story. You could write a whole book about that. So, well, let me I guess, get started, explain why I got started with this. And we'll kind of back up to something I think you alluded to in the introduction. You said my treatment of him was dispassionate. I don't know. There might be some who would argue with that. He is a difficult guy to be neutral about because he's such a overpowering character in some ways. And notice I use the term character as opposed to person because one of the things that maybe we'll get into, hopefully, is that I think that a lot of what in popular culture, both when he was alive and later, that Aleister Crowley was presented at, it was a kind of character that he played. That's always been one of the questions, and it's still a question for me after writing the book, is to what degree this man was what you saw and to what degree that was an act he was putting on. And that also, by the way, has an important connection to his role in intelligence. So the main thing I want to get across is that I am an agnostic when it comes to Crowley's occultism, which means I am neither a believer nor a disbeliever. I don't know whether he could summon angels and demons or not. He seems to have thought he could. Other people said he did, but I wasn't there. I didn't see it. And since that type of thing, as Crowley would be the first to tell you, can be faked in so many ways, you wouldn't know if you were there. But I'm not a follower in the sense that, that basically you could divide opinion to the extent that people have opinions on Aleister Crowley, that either he was a misunderstood genius and a kind of saint, a misunderstood religious figure of the 20th century, or he was a, child-sacrificing Satanist. Okay, there's not much in between. And that's part of what I was looking for in the book, what I started out to do. The thing I didn't start out to do here was to write a full-fledged biography of him. There are lots of those. On the other hand, those biographies tend to be written by people, not always, but tend to be written by people who, for the best intentions, either are in some way believers or they are antagonistic. So I didn't come to it with either. I came to it with a question. And the question was, what connection did Crowley have with British intelligence, and why? The very one that you kind of posed, and I think mostly what we'll be talking about this evening, because it's not a connection that's immediately apparent. It doesn't seem to make much sense. It doesn't make much sense that that a supposedly staid, respectable institution like MI6 or MI5 or Scotland Yard representing the British Crown would ever take into its employ, someone like Crowley, a notorious individual, someone who was widely viewed in Britain, by the way, where he was widely viewed in the press as the wickedest man in the world. So the way that I came to the book was through something else I wrote a few years earlier, and it was an article that I wrote for a journal, an academic journal. I think it was the Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence. And, one of the things about publishing things in academic journals, I'm glad we can do that, but one, you don't get paid for them, just in case anybody was wondering. And two, very few people usually ever read them. There's a kind of joke in academia. Some people don't think it's a joke, that if you actually wanted to hide your research findings, what you do is just publish them in an academic journal, and they'll never be seen. So, and then that's one of the reasons why one of the things I've tried to do is to branch out and publish in other areas, because it is a kind of, I won't say dead end, but it's very limiting in some respects. And Crowley's, a character that's, some people in academia would find questionable as opposed to those outside of it, and really has a kind of broader audience. So what happened was that back around the turn of the century, back around 2000, I love to be able to say that, I was working on another book. I was working on The Secret World of Sidney Reilly, which was another book about spies and revolving largely around things that happened before, during, and after the First World War. So the guy I was interested in that book, Sidney Reilly, was running around New York during World War I, involved in all kinds of intrigues and shenanigans. And one of the things that I knew, sort of in the back of my mind, was that Aleister Crowley was there as well. And I also knew that Crowley, at various times later on in the 20s and the 30s, had claimed periodically, was inclined to tell people that during the war, that is the First War, that he spent almost entirely in the United States, that he had been there doing work for His Majesty's government. And the very strong implication that Crowley had when he would name names, and he did name a few names, was that this connection was mostly with British naval intelligence. This is something maybe I'll elaborate a bit later on. When people think of British intelligence, you tend to think of it if it's one institution, which it's not. It's one of those things that's a house with many rooms. So the British Admiralty had an intelligence system. You had what we call MI6, but which was really a thing called the Secret Intelligence Service. It's really the SIS. That's what James Bond, if he was a real person, would work for. That handles foreign intelligence. That's sort of the version of the CIA. And then you have MI5, the Security Service, which is roughly the British equivalent of the FBI. It's a counterintelligence service. And then Scotland Yard, the Metropolitan Police, which is basically a criminal police, also has special branch and other elements that coordinate with these. For a very brief period of time, the RAF had its own intelligence branch as well. So there are a number of different agencies. And one of the interesting things about when you have different agencies is that it is by no means the case that one agency knows what the other agency is doing.
They're all,
in fact,
they're all very territorial.
They're territorial, and it's also a principle of something called compartmentalization. Mm-hmm. And compartmentalization is just part of, the thing that all intelligence agencies are involved in, really, is an information game. Mm-hmm. And they function to acquire secrets or information, and they function sometimes simultaneously to protect information. So one of the ways that you protect information is that you have as few people in on it as possible. It's the old concept of need to know. And so in compartmentalizing things, it means that even within the same agency, for instance, not everybody knows everything. I mean, the last thing that you want to have is to have someone sitting around with a list of every agent you have in the world. That's virtually suicidal. Okay, especially the age of hacking. So you break things up. The people who really know, the officers, the sort of paid civil servants who are full-time employees of intelligence agencies, who manage assets, which is essentially what Crowley was. He's not an intelligence officer. He was an asset who managed people. They're pretty much the ones who ought to know who those are, and that information isn't shared with everybody. Therefore, one of the things that happened, and by the way, it happened with Crowley, is that one hand of intelligence sees him as a traitor and a threat, while another is, in fact, it has him in their employ and wants him seen as a traitor and a threat. I mean, that works perfectly for them.
Yeah.
And it's one of those kind of odd things that you find, that an agency or an officer within that agency will deliberately play his assets as if they're working for the other side, because that's the people that you're trying to fool. And that gives you an idea as to what his function would be. So I was working on this book on Reilly. And I got curious. I thought, well, Crowley and Reilly were kind of running around, and they both, Reilly had connections to British intelligence, and Crowley claimed, I don't know, maybe I'll check that out. And this is one of the things. I guess it's a kind of standard research procedure that I use, since most of the people that I tend to research are kind of pathological liars. You can't trust anything they say, and therefore you have to go through this whole kind of process of triangulation, of finding out who they're connected with. So I'm always very interested anytime the subject of my research meets someone or goes into business with someone, or I don't know, uses the same public restroom within a 15-minute interval, whatever. It's the type of thing of checking for those connections. And a lot of times they don't pan out to be anything. It's a casual relationship. It's nothing of any particular significance. Other times they're not. But it's one of those things you have to look at very closely. So that's why I was curious. It was just pure curiosity. It was off the subject I was working on. So I thought, well, where could I find that out? Well, one of the things that I've been making a good deal of use of was one of the few troves of intelligence material that has been declassified. And here again is one of those things I point out to your listeners, those who want to be budding spy researchers or to go into this type of thing, is that if you are interested in researching anything to do with modern espionage or intelligence, the first brick wall you're going to hit is that almost universally intelligence records are exempted from any kind of Freedom of Information Act. Does not happen. And agencies are under no obligation to share anything with you, and generally speaking, they're not interested in doing that. And I'll make that very plain. On the other hand, sometimes it's useful to them to share things with you, which, creates this kind of question that, I don't know, since MI6 just gave me access to this dossier, does that just mean they're being nice today? Or does it mean that they have some other reason? Of course, they have some other reason for doing it. The reason for doing that, by the way, is because that will almost always come along with the idea that they get to see whatever it is that you write before you publish it. Which means what they're really interested in is that they're curious about what you know or you might find out, and their way of getting pre-publication review of that is to be helpful. So unselfish acts. So I wrote off to the National Archives in Washington. And what I wrote off to get access to were the thing called the Records of the Military Intelligence Division. Now, today we talk about American intelligence, we may talk about the FBI, the CIA, the DIA, the NSA, but nobody talks about the MID because it's basically a defunct institution. It got absorbed into what's later the Defense Intelligence Agency. But back in World War I, when the U.S. entered the First World War in 1917, we were, it was a simpler time. And one of the things that we really didn't have was much in the way of any kind of intelligence agency. So we had to kind of cobble them together. So it's during World War I, for instance, that this thing called the Bureau of Investigation, later the FBI, before it became the FBI, was really sort of turned partly for that purpose. But it wasn't big enough to handle the volume. And so the Army's intelligence section, basically G2, was built up into a thing called the Military Intelligence Division, or MID, and they just started keeping track of everybody, of any kind of security threat, pro-Germans, anything seditious. I mean, once Congress passed the Sedition Act and the Espionage Act, there was a field day to investigate things. Now, what happened is when that agency sort of, eventually went out of business or subsumed, all of its old, huge 3x5 card files were all digitized and ended up in the National Archives, and you can go and look through them. Now, not all the files are there, but at least there are generally references to what was there, but most of them are. So I knew that for the World War I period, this was the trove. If Americans, if there was any American agency that would have investigated Crowley, it was the MID, and I knew that if they did, there would be a file, right? Well, sure enough, there was a file. It wasn't a very big file. It's, maybe 30 pages long. Like most files, it's, largely full of stuff that isn't very interesting. But there was one report from the headquarters of the United States Military Academy at West Point, where there was a little branch of the MID operating. And what had happened is that there was a military intelligence officer there, and he had become interested in Aleister Crowley because in the summer of 1918, Crowley was camping out. This is in the book. He goes and he camps out on this island in the Hudson River, not far from West Point. Now, Crowley had all sorts of supposed esoteric reasons for doing that. But, you've got this weird Englishman camping out on an island in the river, and that attracted their attention. So they began looking into him, and they found out to their horror that this same Crowley had been connected up until very recently with a pro-German magazine, a magazine called, wait for it, The Fatherland, okay? I think if I was going to create a pro-German magazine, I don't know what more giveaway title I could come up with. But yes, he had written anti-British articles for the Fatherland. I mean, this guy appeared to be a German propagandist, exactly the kind of guy they wanted to round up, except, he was a British subject. So what did the MID do? Before they grabbed him, they inquired with the British consulate in New York. They ought to know something, right? And they did. So here is this really just a couple of sentences. That was, what I really wasn't expecting to find, but here it was. And so in answer to the MID's inquiry, it was determined that Aleister Crowley was an employee of the British government, but at present in this country on official business of which the British consul, New York City, has full cognizance. It continued to say that British government was fully aware of the fact that Crowley was connected with German propaganda and had received money for writing anti-British articles. The British made it very clear that they didn't have a problem with this, and they didn't want the Americans to do anything like arrest him. So they didn't. So what was important about that couple of sentences? Well, it meant that when Crowley later said that he was working for the British government, here was the British government in 1818 saying that, yes, he did. So that led to a little article for this academic journal, Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence. And it wasn't very long, but basically the gist of the article was to say that, hey, look what I found. Aleister Crowley and, an eccentric English figure who claimed on and off to work for British intelligence. Well, guess what? According to this MID report, he did. Now, that was simply the discovery that Crowley wasn't lying when he had claimed to do it. Now, of course, it left a lot of big questions. For instance, like what exactly what he was doing? When they say that Aleister Crowley was in the employ of the British government and in this country on official business, well, what official business? What was he doing? Now, I didn't really want to go any further with it at the time because, remember, I was working on another book, so I thought this was interesting. I wrote a little article, got that article published, it sort of checked that off the list, and I really wasn't going to think much more about it. In fact, I didn't have any intention of carrying it further. But then, you discover one of those things, and that was that Aleister Crowley, while, I don't think a household name, is nevertheless known to a lot of people. And people have opinions about him and know things about him or think they know things about him. So I started getting something that you almost never get to an academic article. I started getting replies. And I started getting little bits of information. And I started getting people popping up going, well, are you going to expand on this? Are you going to tell us more? You should write a book. You should write a book. You should write a book. And since I was writing another one, I didn't pay much attention to it at the time. But to cut to the chase, a few years later, I had another project, which, by the way, I put aside and have never gotten back to. And I was convinced, simply because of the amount of interest that original article had created, that, okay, I'll do further research on this. I'll see if I can figure out what this official business was. I'll dig into it deeper, and I'll see what I can find. And, and frankly, to begin with, I wasn't sure I was going to come up with much. I thought this whole thing would, bottom out pretty quickly. But it didn't. And the more you dug, the more you found. And the more places you found to dig, and the more you would find there. And it eventually developed that what I came up with was that this Crowley's involvement with British intelligence wasn't something.
Okay, we're back. We're cut off. Sorry about that. Okay, so where were we?
Well, after deciding I was going to looking at the possibility of writing a book, guess what? About a year later, I ended up with a book. So there it was. There turned out to be plenty after all, and I think it's one of the things that may be repeating myself a bit, that I've continued to find more. I think it's one of those things that, in some way it's Aleister Crowley is a cornucopia that never stops giving. It's one of those things that people still have interest in. Hands down, of all the things that I've written in my entire career, the Secret Agent 666 book and the article that preceded it have gotten more attention than everything else put together.
Because of Led Zeppelin and Ozzy Osbourne?
That and the Beatles, the entire 60s counterculture, which I suspect Crowley probably would have just hated. But nevertheless, that certainly made him a character. It's one of those things, I guess, that I said at the beginning that when I entered into this, I didn't enter into it as a Thelemite. Okay, I wasn't particularly interested in the I'm not disinterested in the spiritual or metaphysical aspects of it. I mean, it's one of those things that, I get asked a lot because one of the areas that I study along with intelligence is, what could be called occultism. I mean, I've taught a course on occultism, so people there naturally figure that I must be an occultist, somewhere I've got an art or, an altar and a black robe or something. And I don't, really. And if I did, I wouldn't tell you. But the thing about it, I guess the question is why am I interested in something like this? If I'm not a Thelemite, if I'm not interested in it out of a keen interest into metaphysical inquiry, and I guess part of it is that I'm just nosy. That's one of the things that's what historians do. We constantly prowl through the garbage of dead people trying to come up with things that we think other people would be interested in. It's really just sort of, I am not a follower, but I will admit that I found Crowley an intriguing figure before I wrote the book, and when it was done, I found him an even more intriguing figure. And by intriguing, I don't necessarily mean likable or agreeable. I mean, if you form an opinion, one of the things that I've written, the book on Reilly was essentially a biographical study. It focused around a person. The first book I ever wrote on someone that nobody has ever heard of, probably, a Russian revolutionary named Boris Savinkov, same type of thing. I was trying to sort of resurrect this person's historical career. And you nevertheless, you can't spend a lot of time with a person. You can't go through their personal writings. You can't look through their diaries, for instance. You can't look at all the opinions that other people have about them and not ultimately begin to form some kind of opinion of your own. And usually I find that goes through sort of three sort of periods. And initially, when you enter into writing something that's kind of biographical, whether it would be an Aleister Crowley or Sidney Reilly or whoever, you come into it with already some kind of image as to who this person is. And that image generally doesn't hold that very long under closer scrutiny. And you very quickly find out that there's a lot more, occasionally a lot less to this person than you would have assumed. And so your view begins to change. And your view is inevitably sort of affected by the material that comes in. And, and no matter how hard you strive, you have to maintain an objectivity, but you have to realize that you're being influenced by this. So the view generally changes from a kind of naive perception as to who this person was to one that almost inevitably becomes increasingly critical. Because, whenever you look at anyone's life closely, if you examine your own closely, one of the things you tend to see are a lot of the faults and the blemishes. And, you see the mistakes that people made. And it's, probably in Crowley's case or anybody else's, nobody's life ever quite turns out the way that they expected that it would. They never quite turn out being the person maybe that they expected to be. And so it's easy to go from this state of kind of naive perception of the person to one that really just seems to have a lower and lower opinion of them. But I found that in the case with Aleister Crowley, as with Reilly and others, but by the time I got to the end of the process, though, there was another sort of stage. And that's the stage where you sort of put all of this stuff together. And one of the things I think you realize is that despite everything that you learned about this person, all the stuff that you know now that you didn't know at the beginning of the process, one of the things you realize is you still don't know this person totally. In fact, in some ways, they're more mysterious than they were previously. And it has to do largely with the amount of contradictions. And Crowley is a tremendously contradictory person. Contradictory in the sense that I think a good deal of the time he says things for effect, whether it's meant to be comic effect or whether it's meant to be dramatic effect. And so one of the questions becomes, do you take him seriously when he says that? I mean, is this some kind of a very sort of dry joke that he's making, or is it something that he's quite serious about? And the one thing I'd say I did come out of it with is that Crowley, in his own particular way, in his rather dry British style, did have one hell of a sense of humor. He's actually fairly funny on occasion, if you can kind of, catch on to what he's doing. There are comments he makes very interesting. He spent years in the States. He was here from 1914 through almost 5 years. Traveled all around the country. Spent a lot of time in New York, but he visited places like, Hollywood, California, which he didn't like, San Francisco, which he did kind of. Oddly enough, the two cities in the United States that he thought were the only ones that had any real character were New Orleans and San Antonio, Texas. I'm not really sure why. I've been to both of them. But those are the places that he was really, or he was pretending to be impressed by them in some way. Hollywood, he sort of compiled to an overflowing pile of maggots. He was not really impressed by it. And, New York was interesting and vibrant, but dirty. And in the summer, extraordinarily hot. So he really turned out to be, in some ways, more interesting than I thought he would be. But interesting, again, is one of those terms to say something is interesting. In the end, I guess I would agree with one of his writer friends. I think it's Dennis Wheatley, but I could be wrong. It was a British novelist who once said that he kind of liked Crowley, but the two things that he would never do was to lend him money or leave him alone with his children. And I would say that would probably be pretty good advice. And I wouldn't say that because I think that Crowley would actually do anything to the children, but he could probably come up with some imaginative bedtime stories that you you wouldn't necessarily want to have. So it's kind of, for lack of a better term, there's this kind of puckish quality to him. There's a kind of jokester or trickster about him. And that, again, is one of those things that has its connections to intelligence. So goes all the way back to, the question you came up with earlier, how long had he been connected with British intelligence? And I said that in working on the book, it became apparent to me that this was kind of a lifelong connection.
He went to Cambridge, right?
Yes, he went to Cambridge. Didn't, graduate, but he went to Cambridge. That was enough at the time. I mean, in his background, here's part of the background. You can find this in any biography on him. I do discuss it in the book, but it's important to keep in mind. The background is that Aleister Crowley, the guy who becomes the kind of, arch occultist or arch so-called Satanist of the 20th century, really grew up in what we would now call a fundamentalist Christian household. His parents were staunch members of the Plymouth Brethren, which was one of these kind of, the Plymouth Brethren view of the world was pretty simple. Everybody but them was going to hell. Okay. I think some people out there have probably, my mom's church was kind of like that. We have it right, and everyone else are just all sinners and that they're going to hell. And this was the atmosphere that he grew up in, and both his parents took this very seriously. This created a kind of lifelong conflict with his mother. Okay, not too surprising. Aleister Crowley had mommy issues, but on the other hand, his father was a man. The family's money. That's kind of interesting. Where did they get their money from? From Crowley ales, from brewing. Okay, so eventually the whole family, and the larger extended family, had its fortune as brewers. His father, however, had dropped out of the brewing business and had devoted most of his time to being, what a good fundamentalist Christian should do, being a lay preacher. And I think his father, Edward Crowley, who he was basically named after, died when his son was around 11. And that seems to have left a real mark on him. Because in contrast to his mother, I don't know, maybe because he died when he was 11, he idolized his father. I mean, this again is one of these kind of contradictions. Here you have in Aleister Crowley a man who publicly rejected not just fundamentalist Christianity, but rejected Christianity and seemingly everything that it stood for, and wanted to create a new spiritual dispensation, thelema that would replace it. Nevertheless, deeply loved and admired his father, who was a fundamentalist Christian pastor. And one of the ways of looking at something that kind of dawned on me, maybe it should have dawned on me early, that if you look at Crowley's career as a kind of spiritual teacher, he's following in his father's footsteps. His father preached the gospel. Aleister preached his own kind of gospel, but he essentially is doing the same thing that his father did. The other thing about Crowley, though, is that there's even this contradiction that goes on in his relationship with Christianity. I mean, it's one of those things that because of his upbringing, you can now understand, he actually understands pretty well. He's not an outsider on this. He is someone who understands the Gospels, who understands the sort of mystical aspects of the faith and the details of it. Of course, as someone once pointed out to me, no one should be able to preach the gospel with greater sincerity than the devil. So the mere fact that Crowley could preach it, but he's very familiar with it, and often as not, he doesn't come off as hostile. It's something, even in some of his associations with people. I don't know how many people, for instance, out there may know the name of another sort of eccentric British character, a guy named Montague Summers. Have you ever run across him?
No.
Okay. Montague Summers is, somebody can go out there and, get his Wikipedia page. There is one out there. Montague Summers was a kind of a contemporary of Crowley. Like, they lived during the same period of time, and they met each other and were, by, at least in the opinion of others, friends. They could sit down. But Montague Summers was a Catholic and Episcopalian or Anglican priest. Okay, he was like in both churches. How did he do that? That's another story. But he was kicked out of the Anglican Church, but he was brought into this small branch of the Catholic Church. But he was an ordained priest, and therefore, as a priest, a practicing Christian, and a man who, if you look up Montague Summers, just Summers, you'll find that he wrote books he wrote books on the history of vampires and werewolves, and also one called the History of Witchcraft and Demonology. All right. So Summers wrote books on occult subjects, but from the standpoint of a kind of churchman's view. So just in case you were wondering, he doesn't have really good things to say about werewolves or vampires or witches. In his view, they're all just as absolutely wicked as they have ever been described to be. But one of the things he did is that he sort of buttressed this. He did go through old accounts, newspapers from Transylvania or whatever, and his books, I ran across them in a county library as a kid. And they're really kind of creepy because they make this stuff sound, at least halfway convincing. Mm-hmm. But here again, you get this question about Summers. Did he really believe in vampires, or did he just know a kind of, good topic? He was ahead of Twilight by some decades, but nevertheless realized that vampires were going to be big business at some point in the future. And he's also, he's a priest, but he's a defrocked priest. And, it turns out, why was he a defrocked priest? Why had he been kicked out of the Church of England? Want to take any guesses?
Kicked out of the Church of England?
Yeah.
Was he underground Jacobite or something?
No, I think you can sum it up in one word: choir boys.
You don't want to immediately go there. It seemed too obvious. So.
Yes.
Really? Okay.
Oh, yes. You wouldn't. Yeah, it has to be something more mysterious than that, because when. So yes, and in fact, Summers was the member of one of the few sort of gay secret societies, whose name is going to escape me at this point, but it was one which functioned in the sort of fringes of the British establishment.
Okay.
And of course, Crowley, who off and on, passed himself off as being bisexual. I don't know whether that's real or not. So they had something to talk about there. But, so Summers in some ways is really this not quite what he seems. And yet you would assume that someone, even a defrocked priest who thinks that witchcraft is evil would then sit down and have an enjoyable tete-a-tete with someone who in many ways was considered to be the leader of modern witchcraft in Britain. Yet they got along well. Now, the question about that is that they get along because they found enough common denominators to put aside their differences, or was it because that their differences were simply apparent? It comes back to this idea that both of them really could get along with each other because at bottom they didn't really quite believe or advocate the things they publicly appeared to. Now, what makes this all the more interesting is that Summers himself had at least a passing connection to, if not British intelligence, to Italian intelligence, for instance. All right. So one of the things, for instance, a new bit of information is that if anyone reads the book, which of course they should, if they're interested in this, there's a part where we discuss it, and it occurs in the 1930s, and one of the things that's happening is that someone is spying on Crowley in Britain, but they're reporting to him to the Vatican. Okay, there are reports coming from someone, and they're going to this guy, a particular Jesuit in the Vatican who's very interested in investigating occultism, a fellow by the name of Father Joseph Ledit. Well, Ledit isn't terribly important in himself, but the question was, who is this person who is supplying the reports on Crowley? And the only thing we sort of know about them is that they used a code name or a code letter M. So in the book, I come up with a couple of possibilities for that. One is a fellow by the name of Maxwell Knight, who was someone Crowley knew, was another intelligence officer. So that might have been M. But basically, in piecing together little clues that came in later on, I figured out that M is Montague Summers. Once you realize that it's Summers, it makes perfect sense that it's Summers. All of these things, it's like, why didn't I think of that before? So Summers was befriending Crowley, and yet he was also reporting on him. By the way, when Summers died in the late 40s, I think just a little after Crowley did, one of the things that his personal secretary noted was that so-called government men showed up to carry off a lot of his papers. So we can sort of guess who those government men might have been, but you can only guess, and what it was they were looking for in his papers. So I guess one of the things that this immediately touches upon is that if someone like Montague Summers, an author on occult subjects, had some connection to government men, and Crowley had connections to government men, what is it about occultism? What is it about that realm that might attract an intelligence agency? Why would professional spies be interested in this type of thing? Why would they take it seriously? So it goes back to this thing again about information. Your job as a spy, as a professional intelligence officer, is to manage information, to acquire it, often through hostile means, but also through secret means. And to do that, you need access. You need people who know where that information is. Basically, need to get people to talk, or you need to find out who those people would be. So one of the things that it was kind of revealed to me in working on this book, and continues to reveal itself to me and other things I've worked on, is the degree to which the intelligence world and the occult world continually wash over each other. And part of it simply is that, here's the simple explanation of what it is that Crowley offered to anybody in British intelligence. He offered access to social spheres that most other agents or assets couldn't provide. And one of the things about occultism, the secret societies that surrounded it, the various esoteric orders, is that they attracted a unusually well-heeled group of people. One of the things I pretty much figured out was that occultism was not the pastime of the poor. They had folk magic. It wasn't really the pastime of the middle class. It was the pastime. It was the pastime of the upper classes, of people in the nobility and the upper middle class, in the arts, even in the sciences. So it was something that already tended to attract many people from social elites, and it bound them together in various organizations where they could explore interests in things that publicly might not be as acceptable as they were otherwise. So one of the things you could find is that access to occult information and occult organizations sometimes gave you material that was simply blackmail worthy, right? Get somebody connected, find somebody who was naked at a black mass, and that might be something that you could exploit later on. But the other thing is that there also was simply something in the way in which both organizations operated. That secrecy is tremendously important. Within secret societies, within occultism, secrecy is a kind of guiding principle, and the same thing is true within intelligence. So there's a kind of overlap in mentality in some way. There's also a very great emphasis upon, appearing as one thing and being another. The way in which you would obtain information is that you either have to deceive or win the confidence of the people that have that information. And that was something that Crowley could do. So here is how I think it worked in the First World War. And why Crowley became important to the British in New York. Excuse me, there's a dog barking out here. But you want me to hold on for a second?
Is that your dog?
It is. Okay, hold on. I'll be right back.
Okay.
Well, I thought she was stop. I'm locked in my office, and so there are actually two dogs that were painting outside the door. So that's that, and then one of them will start that to get me to come. So anyway, I think I've locked them out into another room. Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
So there we go. All right. So
Yeah,
there's
a practical use for getting into the occult. And these things, getting information, blackmail, human compromise, and these things. Yeah,
and the other thing is that many people on the outside. I mean, most people on the outside of occultism are either frightened of it and will keep their distance, or they are attracted to it and can be manipulated by it in some way. Mm-hmm. So it's a rather handy thing to use. So I think that Crowley got started in this probably when he was at Cambridge, because one of the things that he was being groomed for, he came from a fairly, again, not a rich family, but a respectable family, respectable enough to get him into Cambridge, which you had to know the right people to do. It wasn't his grades that got him into Cambridge. It was the family connection. And one of the things that he admits is that he was sort of being trained for was the diplomatic service. So at some point, he kind of envisioned that he was going to become a British diplomat. And then he talks about taking a kind of trip to Russia around 1898. Okay. And he never made it there, as I recall, but he was on his way through Scandinavia, and he had some kind of, the best way I could describe it, or that he describes it, is that he had some sort of mystical experience, or he had some sort of life-changing experience, and that seems to have been what sent him off on the trajectory towards his increasing interest in metaphysics and occultism, and turned him away from a diplomatic career. What I think is kind of hiding in this is that Crowley was, even then, when he was in college, had been identified as a young man of adventurous spirit. Keep in mind, among the other things, he was an alpinist. He was a world-class mountaineer. And I think this is one of the things that is often forgotten when people tend to think of, Aleister Crowley, he's that, fat guy that looks like Jabba the Hutt, all right? Except he has arms and legs. Well, towards the end of his life, his physique left, but he was certainly, as a young man in his 20s and his 30s, he was an athlete. This was a man who, climbed K2 in the Himalayas, one of the first attempts on that, and was very athletic, physically strong, capable. So you combine someone who had physical stamina with someone who would apparent already early on had a kind of flexible morality. Someone who wasn't too overly tied to hard definitions of right and wrong. Now, it doesn't take too much imagination to figure out why in spy work, flexible morality might be useful in that case.
We could use a guy like you.
Okay. Now, it's like, I think, again, I quote somewhere in the book that there's another, I don't think it's John Le Carre, but someone else who was being, introduced into British intelligence and said, well, the thing you have to do, you have to be able to lie and steal and kill, right? You may have to do those things. You shouldn't do them unless you have to, but you need to be prepared to do it, and you can't be squeamish about it. So in the case of Crowley, I think they could have found someone who wasn't likely to be squeamish about those things.
Yeah. In your book, you have I have it right here. John Le Carre, in a BBC interview, talked about why people remained spies and the subtle reward it offers. Le Carre, David Cornwell, had a long career in British intelligence, something long assumed by many of his readers, but only recently acknowledged by the author. He likened his recruitment while a student at Oxford University to a religious awakening. I really believed at last that I had found a cause I could serve. It was as if the whole of my life had prepared me for the moment, he continued. It was like joining the priesthood. It's easy to imagine Crowley saying much the same. Le Carre also added to the equation an inner, somewhat perverse satisfaction in deception and the dignity which great secrecy confers upon you.
Yeah.
So, sorry.
Yeah, there's that certain smugness that anybody has when you know something that other people don't. And you know something the other people don't, and you also know that they're never going to know it.
Yeah, I'm in the inner circle. I know more than you. Yeah.
Well, and again, I'll put out the fact that I've never belonged to, I'm not a Crowleyite. I don't belong to any secret societies, and I've never worked for any intelligence agency. And again, if I did, I wouldn't tell you. But nevertheless, I haven't. But in talking to people who have, which is one of the things that I do, you often come up against that, which is that, I could, the old joke, I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you.
Yeah.
Okay. I've never actually had anybody say that, but I've had them say that, I wish I could tell you the rest of it, but I can't. All right? I took an oath to never talk about these things, and that means never.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, I may kind of hint around this, and you can try to draw out of what I'm saying what you think, but I'm not going to tell you whether that's right or wrong. And that's what it is. Again, it's that cult of secrecy, and the secrecy itself, I think, in some ways, almost begins to operate like a drug. That this ability that one has knowledge, and then again compare that to what it is arguably that occultism offers. What does every secret society and every mystical order offer? It offers knowledge you can't get anywhere else. All right? You join this organization, you will then learn secrets of the universe, the mysteries of life and death that no one else will have. So that's what, again, I think the thing that really combines intelligence and occultism together is a very, very similar mindset. It's very easy to go from one. One is very translatable to the other one.
Yeah, it's similar to the intelligence community's ties to organized crime.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
the same
organized
murky world, yeah.
Flexible morality.
Yeah.
People who have skills that you could use. So I think he was probably scouted for this when he was at university. I think probably if they were thinking about sending him on some sort of test run to Russia. The interesting thing is that in 1898, the period he's talking about, Britain and Russia were not friends. They were adversaries. This was before Germany became Britain. And so Russia, kind of like today, was the great sort of enemy of the British Empire. And therefore, sending any kind of diplomatic personnel into Russia almost always entails some degree of intelligence function or vetting, because you were being sent into the sort of enemy territory. But that's probably what he was being given. He was being given some kind of small quasi-diplomatic cover assignment that was in some ways going to test his ability to operate as an asset in a foreign country. Is he going to be caught right away? Is he it's probably something simple. You're going to go in, you're going to meet a couple of people, and you're going to come back and give us a report about what you saw. Or you're just going to walk around and give us a report about what you saw. Remember, the ability to observe and report is also a very key element. Knowing what to look for, knowing who to talk to. And any kind of acquaintance with the occult world, of course, gives you this whole kind of netherworld to penetrate. A world, for instance, in which generals or statesmen or ambassadors or dukes or princes or who knows, kings and czars could operate on a different level and where you could learn more things about them. So from that point on, I think Crowley was employed whenever it was thought useful. And the book chronicles some of those. The main one, of course, tends to revolve around his appearance in New York aboard the Lusitania on Halloween 1914. Okay, how do you like that? So, see, that's one of those things that I've had people ask me, well, did he plan it that way? Probably not, because the shipping schedules plan things that way. But nevertheless, it's, did he see some portent in that? Possibly. Or maybe it's one of those things. But anyway, it's a curious coincidence, if nothing else. So he arrived in New York, ostensibly, as he describes it in his memoirs. He arrived there on some kind of economic mission. He was going to go there because this was the beginning of the war, and the British were trying to put out large business contracts for shells and rifles in New York. Remember, the United States, here again, a little mini history lesson here. The United States did not enter World War I until towards the end. Okay, so the war started in 1914. The U.S. didn't enter until about 3 years later, until April 1917. So prior to that, the United States is a neutral country. But it's a very important neutral country because it has huge industrial capacity and it also has large amounts of money. And so one of the things that really keeps the Allied war effort alive, one of the things that becomes absolutely essential to the British and the French and even the Russian war efforts is getting contracts for weapons and munitions in the United States and also getting loans. The British war effort is literally kept alive by loans brokered by J.P. Morgan and Company. Wall Street is clearly on the Allied side. So it makes sense in some way that that Crowley would go over under some sort of economic cover, but that's not really what he was there for. What he really came to New York for in October 1914 was to track down an Irish revolutionary named Sir Roger Casement. So Sir Roger Casement, again, is one of those people that outside of Irish schoolrooms, most people haven't heard of, but probably should have. Roger Casement, because he was a Sir Roger Casement, he was Irish born, but remember Ireland was part of the British Empire at that time, and he had been for most of his life a loyal servant of the British Crown. In fact, he had served Queen Victoria as a diplomat in Africa and in South America, and he also had become a kind of a world-recognized figure because what Casement had done is that he had carried out undercover investigations of colonial abuses in the rubber plantations in the Amazon and in the Congo Basin. And he had discovered all kinds of horrible things.
This was like King Leopold's kingdom, right?
Yes, King Leopold. So anybody who knows anything about King Leopold and the Congo knows that it was a incredibly nasty affair. And that's one of the things that Casement's investigation revealed. You know, he literally sort of dug up the dirt on these abuses, and that led to international conferences and international laws to restrict this, the whole stage. So he was fairly well known for his time. But the other thing about Casement is that his study of imperialist abuses also gradually turned him against the very empire that he served. And what he began to do is one of those things that can be kind of dangerous to do when you begin connecting observations you made in one area to another one. And so what Casement did is that he realized that, well, yeah, you know, the Belgians really did horribly misrule the Congo, and the Brazilians misrule the Amazon, just like the British misrule Ireland. And so he became an Irish revolutionary, a Fenian. And he became so convinced of this that when war broke out between England and Germany in August 1914, Casement went to New York. He went to this neutral country across the Atlantic where he knew, for instance, that Irish revolutionaries could function freely. Okay. So remember, by this time, by 1914, there were more Irish in America than there were in Ireland. Mm-hmm. And just like later on, where did all the money for the IRA came from? It came from Boston. It came from Chicago. It came from Irish Americans. So he went there. Casement went to New York to, first of all, make connections with the sort of IRA in New York, but also with German diplomats. Okay, people like Franz von Papen and Captain Boy Ed, and even perhaps the German ambassador in Washington, Count von Bernstorff. So he went to a neutral country, which was friendly to Ireland, and he conferred with German diplomatic personnel, and he put a deal before him. He goes, look, England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity, and myself representing the Irish Republican Brotherhood, can you give us money and weapons and advisors to raise a rebellion in Ireland? Okay, so keep in mind at that point, no matter how much one may sympathize with Roger Casement, he had crossed the line into high treason. He was now, during a time in which the country he was a citizen was at war, was consulting with its representatives in a foreign country to foment rebellion in his homeland. So, clearly, there were people in London who wanted to keep track of Roger Casement, or even better yet, put him out of business. So, when Crowley left England, when he set sail in the Lusitania from Liverpool, the reports, which he was aware of, was that Casement was still York. And so my argument, which I feel pretty firm about, is that what Crowley was really going there to do was to suss out what it was that Casement was doing. That's because from the minute Crowley arrives in New York, he poses as an Irishman. He poses as what? An Irish patriot, which he's not, which he's never been before. I mean, Crowley's not Irish. I don't even think he'd ever been to Ireland. He's about as English as you can get. But he gets off the boat. He tells the U.S. immigration officials that he's Irish, and he starts telling everybody else who will listen to him that he's Irish. Oddly enough, the Irish in New York don't pay much attention to him, but the Germans do.
Mm-hmm. So he's proving his bona fides with the Germans by claiming he's an Irish nationalist.
Right. He's claiming that's what he's claiming. But the other idea is that would give him access to one of the people, for instance, that he notes meeting. Right. In fact, a guy who meets him at the boat, literally, is an Irish American, an important Irish American art dealer and also political figure in New York, a guy by the name of John Quinn. So John Quinn is part of the New York political establishment and well-to-do there. He's well-connected socially in New York, so he can sort of help Crowley in that standpoint. But he's also noted as an Irish patriot, but not as a kind of IRA-style patriot. The other thing about Quinn, and this is what made more sense, I also found out that John Quinn, while being an Irish patriot, also was a regular visitor and informer at the British consulate in New York. In other words, he was a spy for the crown, or at least he supplied them with information. So Crowley comes over in the Lusitania, gets off the boat, is literally met at the dock by someone who is another British asset spying on the Irish. One of the people that Quinn had contact with recently was Roger Casement. So he would be the perfect person to give him some idea. What he told Crowley, however, is that Casement had disappeared. He'd vanished from New York. So this is, when then Crowley notes in his autobiography that, well, I arrived in New York and I found out that my egg was addled. I found out that, what I'd come over for was and that makes no sense if he was there to buy munitions, because that was a going business. It does make sense if his job was to pick up Casement's trail and he showed up only to find that Casement was gone. So this comes back to the question, okay, well, suppose he was doing that, but why would they send Crowley to check up on Casement? Well, remember, Casement's big secret was that he was gay. All right? And remember, this is 1914, and those are the type of things that employ the British government, even if everybody knew about it, you didn't talk about. Mm-hmm. So Crowley, remember, also claimed to be bisexual, to have some acquaintance with that kind of underworld. So what you needed, if you wanted to track Casement in New York, and especially if you wanted to get the dirtiest dirt on him you could, you needed someone who could not just penetrate the Irish underground, but also the homosexual underground, that sort of demi-monde that he would operate. So when you look at it that way, Crowley was someone who had the particular experience, skills, knowledge, and connections that would help it. But so then he had to find something else to do. And what he does is that he turns himself into a German propagandist. He meets a guy named George Sylvester Viereck, who is a German-American editor of the Fatherland, and Viereck hires him to write really scurrilous anti-British propaganda. I mean, there's no getting around that. Things where he calls the king a dwarf. At one point, Crowley writes an article sort of praising German Zeppelins setting London on fire. The type of thing you figure that after the war, when you went back to England, people might have questions about. Okay. I mean, clearly, what Crowley did in New York, what he wrote in New York, if it wasn't treason, it was very, very close to it. He didn't cross the same line that Casement did, but he nonetheless certainly skirted that. The interesting thing to sort of cut ahead is that what repercussions does Crowley ever officially suffer for writing anti-British propaganda? Nothing.
Yeah, it's like
right.
World War II, there was Lord Haw Haw?
Yeah.
Who actually I think he did hang.
Yeah.
But he went to Germany and I think did broadcasts. But But in this case, it might not. Who knows? Maybe Lord Haha was like a triple agent.
You never know.
You never know.
I literally, you never do know. And his whole hanging was faked, and he, lived out his life on some pleasant island off the coast of Scotland.
Yeah.
But that wouldn't be true because there are no pleasant islands off the coast of Scotland, apparently. But anyway, so Crowley didn't quite, he was writing German propaganda or anti-British propaganda in a neutral country, but still, and this was known. This was picked up, and the British press certainly knew about it, and they raised a stink about it when he came home. In the British press, he was denounced as a traitor, but the British government, in fact, in particular, British security and intelligence services, never had a bad thing to say to him about it. And there's a reason for that, because he was doing, as that MID report noted, they knew exactly what he was doing, and he was doing exactly what they wanted him to do.
Yeah, this is part of that compartmentalization you were talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And one of the things is that in the view, let's say, of MI5, sort of the British FBI, MI5 always thought there was something dirty about Crowley. They never trusted him. They never forgot his actions during the war. They always thought he was highly suspicious. And I think that suited other people, especially in the Admiralty's intelligence area, just fine. They wanted him to think that about him. I mean, it's part of your credibility. So let's put it this way. If you're trying to infiltrate someone, if you're trying to infiltrate a mole into, let's say, the German propaganda apparatus in New York, which is what he was penetrating, he has to get some way for the Germans to trust him. And really, why should they do that? See, that's the next question. Why would the Germans trust him? Why would they ever take anything that he said seriously, even if he agreed to write propaganda for them? Well, I think there are a couple of reasons for that. And the most important one is a connection that Crowley made just before the war broke out. And that connection was with another guy, which the episode is mentioned in the book. And it's another one of those things I've learned more details about since. But the fellow is a German occultist and journalist by the name of Theodor Reuss, Reuss. So Theodor Reuss was the guy, if anybody's ever heard of the OTO, the Ordo Templi Orientis, an organization that Crowley sort of later became the head of, which still exists today. Well, the guy who actually founded that, or one of the people who founded it, was Theodor Reuss. It was a German organization. It was a German secret society that sort of originally aspired that it was going to be a kind of universal secret society that would include all the other Freemasonry, Rosicrucians. They'd all be brought under the umbrella of the OTO. So in 1912, in Berlin, Crowley was initiated into the OTO by Theodor Reuss. So I said that Reuss was a journalist. He was a journalist who worked mostly in London, but that in fact was his cover, because guess what else Theodor Reuss was besides being an occultist and a journalist? He was a British intelligence agent. And not British, not British. He was a German intelligence agent. And his job was, or part of this, was to create the OTO, I think for his own private reasons. I mean, I think that he had his own kind of, let's say, spiritual reasons to do that. But the other thing it did is that it served admirably as a potential tool for German intelligence. So remember what he was creating. He was creating a kind of overarching occult society, the OTO, which would bring in existing organizations, not all of Freemasonry, branches of it, a whole variety of Rosicrucian and synarchist societies, Gnostic churches, you name it. They take anybody. So it would have widespread connections. And the other point is that it was to become an international body. It was to spread to all the countries of the world. So what have you got? A secret organization secretly under the control or connected to German intelligence, which functions as a secret society in the English-speaking world, in South America, in Australia, everywhere. Okay. One of the things, again, it becomes an ideal cover for intelligence activities. So in 1912, Reuss initiates Crowley into this and essentially names Crowley, you're going to be the head of the organization in all the English-speaking countries. which would include America. So when Crowley went to America again in October 1914, he also went as something else. He went as a representative of the British government on both the cover and real level. And then he also went as a representative of Royce and the OTO, which meant he simultaneously went as a representative of German intelligence. So the simple reason as to why the German diplomats and propagandists in New York accepted him is because people in Berlin told them to. And the main person in Berlin who did that was Theodore Royce, who, what did he do during the war? He worked full-time for German intelligence. So Royce, the guy who initiated Crowley into the OTO during the same war, becomes a high figure in German intelligence in Berlin, and he's the guy who gives the bona fides to Crowley. That's why they trust him. And one of the things, Ian, you can find in the book is that Crowley is in contact with Royce all through the war. Royce is busy doing things like trying to organize Masonic conferences in Switzerland, which are also being manipulated by the Germans in order to try to advance early peace proposals. So, it's one of those things that shows again that this connection between occultism and intelligence isn't some peculiar British thing. The Germans did it as well. And to me, it explains why Crowley was able to pick up the pieces of his mission to New York, why he was able to successfully insinuate himself into the confidence of the Germans in America. Now, if he wasn't chasing Roger Casement anymore, Roger Casement, where did he go, just to finish off that story? Well, he escaped New York, and he actually successfully got to Berlin to plead his case in front of the German general staff. And they didn't give him much aid. They really wouldn't promise him very much, just one shipload of arms. But they put him on a U-boat, and then in early 1916, they dropped him off of the coast of Western Ireland, and this was just before something called the Easter Rebellion took place. Mm-hmm. So later on, that's reasonably well known to some people. One of the big events in modern Irish history is the Easter Rising, and that Easter Rising is the rebellion that Casement started negotiating with Germans in New York. What happened to Casement, though, is he was captured by a constable, taken back to London, put on trial for high treason, sentenced to death, and hanged. So that's what happened to real traitors. Roger Casement died at the end of a rope. And by the way, one of the things that the British government used to make sure that he was hanged, because remember, he was someone who had, as you might have expected, there would be people who would argue that because of his past service to the crown, because of all the good and wonderful things that he'd done, that certainly he should be spared the death penalty. Well, that's when Scotland Yard came up with the Black Diaries. And the Black Diaries, yes. The Black Diaries were, essentially his sort of recounting of his sexual escapades with men and boys all around the world in graphic detail. And once that came out, and this was 1916, all of Casement's friends and supporters pretty much ran for cover, and they hanged him.
It was like his Twitter account had been...
Yes, okay, they got hold of his Twitter account. Okay.
But in the book, you suggest perhaps that might have been planted? Like, that's too obvious a piece of evidence?
Well, there's an ongoing debate today. I mean, the part of it is that there are people who just absolutely do not want to believe that their hero, Roger Casement, was ever gay, right? That's part. And actually, I think that may, in some degree, if you leave the Black Diaries out of it, in other words, if you argue that those are a forgery, it's possibly debatable. On the other hand, it seems to have been one of the things that other people who knew Casement well sort of recognized. I mean, remember, this was, Edwardian hypocrisy at its finest. Everybody knew what his predilections were, but so long as they were private, no one was ever going to talk about them.
Is there any evidence that Crowley supplied that diary?
It's one of those things that it's sort of, I can't see how he would be in the place and time to do it. On the other hand, it's not impossible that he picked up information in New York. I'm sure that if he came across anything in New York that might have assisted in the compiling them, if that was necessary, then he would have supplied it. That was part of his job. But it's not something that he could have done on his own. I don't think we could lay that at his feet. Now, the interesting thing is that what Crowley later told people, and he said this on more than one occasion, is that what his real mission in America became What it was really about wasn't catching Roger Casement or getting any dirt on him or war supplies. It was the big mission, the big sort of secret goal of British intelligence, which was to bring the United States into the war. Now, the interesting thing about it is that really was the ultimate secret goal of British intelligence in the United States, to bring the U.S. into the war. And one of the reasons I can say that is because someone else that I've done a fair amount of research on is the guy who was the formal head of what we would call MI6 in New York, who was a fellow by the name of Sir William Wiseman.
Yeah, he's
I got to write a book about him.
Yeah, he's a very not unreported figure, but an important figure in the early 20th century. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he later becomes a big deal on Wall Street. He later becomes a Hollywood producer.
thus linking the occult intelligence to
and Hollywood, and to the entertainment industry. If you ever wonder who was sort of one of those people pushing for pro-British films in the 1930s, things like Gunga Din. Mm-hmm. Okay, I don't. Have you ever seen Gunga Din, the old film with has Wallace Beery and Cary Grant? All right. Mm-hmm. So the whole plot of that, of course, is that it extols the British Raj. All of the Englishmen in it are quirky but pillars of decency. Mm-hmm. And of course, who are they up against? Horrible devil worshipping snake cultist Indian nationalists. All right,
this is at a critical moment too in British.
Right, and this is a period, when India was still a part of the British Raj, but Indian nationalism. And what those films are, as entertaining as they may be, if if anybody out there sees Gunga Din or Lives of a Bengal Lancer, any of those films that came out in that period, they are propaganda pieces for British imperialism.
Yeah, this is the Quarter Circle, and I saw one that my kids were watching a Shirley Temple movie. I think it was called The Little Princess. And it's just one big Queen Victoria is great, and it's one big pro-British Empire movie. Yeah, it's fun.
And all the loyal Indians are wonderful and happy, and all of the nationalists are evil people. So, and the thing is that it's one of those things that's not just screenwriters. Okay, that's people at the production level. What Wiseman was connected with was a thing called Lasky's Famous Players, and behind that he was also a partner in one of the big investment banks, Kuhn Loeb and Company. And they have the money, and people who have money in Hollywood, no surprise, tend to have an influence, and that was part of his job. And when World War II rolls along, by the way, Wiseman goes right back into the service for British intelligence. Mm-hmm. So Wiseman said exactly the same thing that Crowley said, that Wiseman knew that his job, when he shows up in the U.S. about 2 years later after Crowley, about in the fall of 1916, actually early in the part of 1916, when Wiseman shows up, he later says that, yes, my ultimate job, my job was to keep track of, Indian seditionists and Irish revolutionaries and German propagandists. I was supposed to do all of that stuff. But my real job was to bring America into the war. So it's interesting that the guy who is essentially the head of MI6 and Crowley are claiming that they were working to a common goal. That was the goal of British intelligence, because getting the U.S. into the war was the only way to guarantee that America's monetary and industrial support remained behind the Allied cause. So there's an untold story in terms of how that happened. And the interesting thing is that both Crowley and Wiseman believed that they had been successful. Now, in Wiseman's case, he believed he'd been successful because he became close friends to President Woodrow Wilson's confidential advisor, Colonel Edward House. And Colonel Edward House got William Wiseman basically free access to the White House. I mean, I want you to try to imagine that working today, in which a presidential advisor was discovered to have introduced the head of a foreign intelligence agency not only to the president, but to have facilitated their meetings. And to give you another idea as how it worked, Wiseman could go and have a meeting with the president without having a prior appointment. The Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, needed an appointment. So here is a foreign spy who has greater access to the White House than the Secretary of State. So, Wiseman felt that he had gotten the ear of the most important person in the country. So I guess that would now qualify under meddling. Now, Crowley wasn't anywhere near that level, but he also tended to think that he'd played a role in this. And one of the ways that he thought he'd played a role, or he claimed he'd played a role, is by encouraging the Germans to sink the very ship that he'd come to America on, Lusitania. So in early May 1915, in a story that most people have heard of at some point, the Lusitania was torpedoed by the U-20 off the south coast of Ireland. It went down very quickly, a lot faster than anybody expected. More than 1,000 people died, including more than 100 Americans. And that set off a diplomatic crisis between the neutral United States and Germany. And it did not. I'll still run across this every now and then. And, I have students who will write this in a paper, and then I have to flunk them on it. But the whole thing is they'll say that when the Germans sank the Lusitania and that brought America into the war. No, that didn't happen. It was 2 years later. But what it did do was it started the process. It gave the Germans a tremendous PR black eye that they could never recover from. They could never dig themselves out of that hole. So how did Crowley argue that he contributed to that? Well, remember, he started writing propaganda. And his friend Viereck, who was the editor of the Fatherland, introduced Crowley, and he did, to a thing called the Propaganda Cabinet. And the Propaganda Cabinet was a private meeting, a kind of secret society of German, some of them were newspaper editors, some of them were consuls, diplomatic figures. Again, one of them was the military attaché Franz von Papen. And they met in New York, and their job, the British want to bring America into the war, right? So what do the Germans want to do?
Keep America out.
Keep America out. Okay, they want to discourage the Yankees from help. They don't want the Americans coming in because they know they'll come in on the Allied side.
Just remind them who burned the White House.
Yeah, but they did,
yeah, that's a century ago, right?
And the British propaganda was always good. Things happened in the past, but it was, they try to pretend that the Revolutionary War never really happened.
All was forgivable. Never mind.
Yes, blood is thicker than water, and we speak the same language.
Exactly. Yeah. I like how they call it the Propaganda Cabinet. Now, if they were British, they would have called it like the Committee for Public Information or something, right?
Or the Daffodil Club.
Yeah.
Okay. The whole point was never to have a name that you would have. So keep in mind, these are German publicists, academics, and officials in the neutral United States, and they're meeting because the whole goal of German propaganda, what it is they're talking about, was to keep the Americans out. So the question is, what's the best way to do that? I don't know. Do we try to inform Americans about the burning of the White House? Maybe that's what we should do. Do we try to dredge up the Revolutionary War, or do we just try to explain to them, Germany's cause? That was actually one of the things they tried early on, is that, Germany's really being picked on, but, we're surrounded and we're being beset by the French and the Russians and the British and everybody, and we haven't done anything to them. And this is where Crowley said he came in. Crowley, remember, can claim to be, what is he? He's a master of metaphysics. And on the basis of that, he could claim that he knew a great deal about the subtleties of the mass psychology of Anglo-Saxons, right? Mm-hmm. And, at that point in time, Anglo-Saxons were, practically speaking, the ruling class of the United States. And therefore, that was what you wanted. So he goes, the way he influenced it. So he said, look, my experience with the Americans has taught me this. Americans are childlike people. They're not inherently militaristic. They're childlike in the sense that they respond to firmness and they respond to fear. And therefore, rather than trying to lecture them about things that they really don't have the intellectual capacity to understand, you just basically need to scare the bejesus out of them. And the way to do that is to show them that Germany is powerful and shouldn't be messed with. And he goes, and a way to do that would be to sink the Lusitania. What was so special about the Lusitania? Well, it was a big liner, yes. It was the pride of the British commercial fleet. I mean, the Lusitania and its sister ships were the sort of biggest liners afloat. They were something that were seen as a symbol of British power, especially British maritime power. The other thing the British were doing, which the Germans were well aware of, and the Americans kind of aware of, is that, all those munitions and stuff that were being produced in the United States? Well, they were stuffing the holds of the Lusitania, a passenger ship, but also a ship that carried cargo, with unassembled artillery shells, gun cotton, rifle breech, everything you could think. They were full of it. So it was carrying war supplies.
Yeah, mixing bullets with babies.
Mixing bullets with babies. And the interesting thing is that under international law, that made it a legitimate military target. And so the Germans actually did have the legal cause to sink it because it was carrying war contraband. And of course, it was also carrying more than 1,000 passengers. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the reasons. And they had other plans to sink it. Their main plan was that they wanted to place a bomb aboard and they wanted to sink it in port. That was what the original German idea was, not to do it with a U-boat, but to put a bomb aboard. They actually had people working aboard the ship, and they were either going to sink it in New York Harbor or they were going to sink it in Liverpool. But that way, they argued, it would put the ship out of business. Everybody would see it. They couldn't claim it just, sank and disappeared, mm-hmm. and nobody would get hurt. It would be unlikely to harm a large number of people. So instead, it ended up being torpedoed off the Irish coast. One of the things that probably speeded the sinking of the Lusitania, this is a controversy to today, is that, some of those munitions it was carrying blew up. There was what really sent the ship to the bottom as fast as it did was a secondary explosion.
Yeah, for a while, they tried to say that the U-boat had sunk, had fired a second torpedo, but now, it was the explosion. Yeah. The
torpedo and then the secondary explosion, and I think odds are that had something to do with the stuff that was in the holes, and it wasn't cheese. that was one of the things. If you actually look at the manifest, apparently the Lusitania was full of cheese. But as someone was able to figure out, that cheese wasn't really cheese. It was, the manifests were falsified. So this was one of those things that Crowley was argued that he was influential in. And was he later exaggerating his role? Well, I don't know. Most people probably exaggerate their role if they have one. But I think from his standpoint, I think he was telling something that he thought was true. I think that he had seen that his role. So basically, to the German propagandists in the U.S., this is what you need to do. They then communicated that back to Berlin, and the upshot out of it is that the decision was made, maybe not just for that reason, but as part of that reason, that it was the Lusitania was torpedoed and sank, and everything else followed from then. And it did not turn out to be something that would scare the Yankees into not entering the war. In fact, it largely assured that they would. So
the other side of that, is the British seem to be maneuvering the Lusitania too into its ultimate doom, because
there have been at least a couple of the classic book written about that, which has been which some people believe is a work of genius and others believe is a crock of lies. Is a book by Colin Simpson mm-hmm. on the Lusitania. And in that, Simpson, lays out pretty much the case that the Lusitania was being deliberately set up, that its escort was withdrawn, that it was basically being redirected through an area where you knew there were U-boats. And see, the interesting thing about being attacked by a submarine in 1915 is that there was basically no such thing as radio communication. So when U-boats went out in that period, unlike World War II, where they operated in wolf packs, they were basically on their own. They're like these lone hunters. Mm-hmm. So what they would do is that they would just sort of operate. They would bob around known shipping lanes, and then you do what a hunter does. You wait for your prey to show up and ambush them. So to be sunk by the U-20 at that particular spot on that particular day it's one of those things that I don't see how you could plan it, because you would have to plan it from both ends. I do think that there's something that the British Admiralty was certainly willing to take risks. Mm-hmm. And you can even argue that, and I certainly don't put it past them, if you keep the guy that Admiral Reginald Hall was the guy who ran Admiralty Intelligence, was probably Crowley's ultimate superior in that sense. Hall is a guy who would do anything to achieve his goal. And if that anything included setting up a British liner to be sunk and then exploiting the propaganda value, he would do it. Remember, this is a war. Mm-hmm. And in a war, you are in any British commander on the Western Front could order attack that would certainly send thousands of men to their deaths.
Yeah, a year later was the Somme.
Yeah. So, where you got 20,000 killed in half an hour and 60,000 in one day. So what's 1,000 or so civilians for the greater cause in this case? And, an interesting question might be if there was, and this is an if the Admiralty itself was trying to set up the Lusitania, remember, this again would sort of work if it makes even more sense if Crowley is an Admiralty asset in that he's also functioned because he's encouraging the Germans to do exactly what it is the Admiral wants them to do. And it's actually quite insidious. But the thing about this is that once you sort of put the pieces together, you see how that insidiousness works.
Well, they call it Perfidious Albion for a reason.
Perfidious Albion for a reason. You have to do. They didn't get that empire by being nice. Okay,
fit of absence, right?
No, it wasn't just one of those things that suddenly fell into their lap or was a result of all of their kind treatment for things. There was a lot of lying and cheating and looting, raping, and pillaging that went on in order to achieve that. But that's the way empires are born, and that's the way empires are sustained. I guess the other question that comes up in this is that, why would Crowley, who seems to be, shall we say, a nonconformist, okay, not someone, he publicly rejected all forms of sexual propriety and morality. Why would someone like that have the slightest degree of patriotism? That's not something you would expect from Crowley. And yet it's one of those things that as I began to do the research, and I've seen more of since, is that Crowley was, in his own particular way, a patriotic Englishman. That's what, there's this statement he gives, again, it's in the book here, and I'm going to have to paraphrase it, but at one point he sort of asks in explanation, essentially, why would a man like you be interested in serving his country? And he gives a reply that is roughly, he says, I don't believe for a minute that the English kettle is any less black than the German pot. All right. I don't believe that England is somehow morally superior to Germany. But he says that my loyalty is the loyalty of Bill Sykes' dog. That's a Dickens reference there. It's an Oliver Twist. And my master may beat me and starve me, but in the end, I am his dog and I love him. And that's basically, it's one of those things where it may just be me, but in that particular point, I think that Aleister Crowley was being completely honest in his feelings. I think he was trying to explain the kind of this kind of internal contradiction, or maybe it wasn't a contradiction, as well as he could. He might despise what he thought was the phony morality of Edwardian Britain. He might think that it was corrupt in any number of ways, but the thing was, he was an Englishman. He wasn't a German, and he wasn't a Frenchman, and he wasn't an American. He was an Englishman, and that's where this kind of visceral loyalty lay. The loyalty of Bill Sykes' dog. My master beats me and starves me, but I'm still his dog, and I love him. And I think in that way he was just trying to explain, and it's something that comes out, I think he told someone that, his sort of unfulfilled desire was to be an English squire. And so in a way, I think I may have put it in the book, certainly I've said it before, that the feeling I came away with was that Aleister Crowley was a kind of cultural rebel in which there was an English conservative screaming to get out. All right, that there were always these kind of, and see, it comes back to this question: is what's the real guy? When it really would come down to the clinch, when it was an issue, what were those loyalties? And I think that was an example that at the bottom of it, that Crowley had this loyalty to England, an almost kind of visceral, unreasoning, emotional attachment. I think another way that if he didn't put it, somebody else did. It's this kind of it was a thing that came up, and the question was as to why people joined the Communist Party in the 20s and 30s. And by extension, other sort of radical political movements, even the Nazis in this case. And the explanation that one person came up with, they go, look, I didn't join the Communist Party because I was intellectually convinced of the validity of its arguments. I joined the Communist Party, and I spent years as a loyal communist because I fell in love with it. And see, once that happens, when someone falls in love with an idea, or they fall in love with some image of a country, the thing about love is that reason, logic goes out the window. All right. You can see that in all the people that your friends fall in love with. You realize it probably wasn't such a good idea, but that nevertheless, you're never going to convince them of that otherwise. So yeah, I think that Crowley was, a kind of visceral patriot, and that's what drew him to this. And I think along with just the kind of desire for adventure and for deceit, it gave him a chance to use all kinds of skills like hypnotism. So remember I said earlier that go ahead. Yeah,
the Empire sort of gave him a purpose then. The various the opportunities to exercise his black magic, and also the cynicism in his remarks. Sort of, well, that sort of is an expression of the whole British imperial enterprise, is sort of the British cosmology, where there really is no morality universe. It's all, it's empiricism and it's practicalism. Where these practical pursuits of power, and therefore you're not going to rest your activities or they're based on some idealism or morality, because that's not a practical way to run the world. You have to be sort of ruthless and cynical, and that what he said there is just exposing sort of an emptiness, and it's kind of the type of something you might hear from a James Bond or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the type of thing that, at the end of it, you might figure out that pretty much you've been used, and not necessarily for the most noble of causes, but nevertheless, it's a cause you understand.
Similar? Didn't Philby say something like, I served country, king, and club or something?
Oh, well, Philby, Kim Philby was, the famous another very famous British trader who served the Soviets. No, the statement I remember from Philby is that when asked, after he defected to the Soviet Union, he was asked, I think by Philip Knightley, he was a British journalist who went to interview him. And the question you want to ask a Philby is, why? Uh-huh. Okay? Why did you turn your back on your country, your class, everyone, and do this? And Philby's kind of flippant response, I think I'm getting it right, is that one never looks twice at the offer of enlistment in an elite service. And what it was, see, Philby was a guy who was being groomed, again, at Cambridge, or at least through school, to be a British spy, and is in British intelligence. He's trained and groomed by the British to be an intelligence, and he's recruited by the Soviets at university, where they had agent spotters who were there to try to figure out who were people who might be susceptible to recruitment, and he was. And in fact, after he was recruited, Philby, for some years, outwardly appeared to be a pro-fascist.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, he posed as a pro-fascist.
And then again, and wrote, articles extolling Franco in Spain, extolling Hitler in Germany. And this was all as part of a cover. All the while, he is actually functioning as a Soviet agent. But I think what Philby interpreted in this concept about you never look twice at enlistment in an elite force is that the other thing that Philby realized is that he is a British intelligence officer. And his chief opponent, what he's working against, are the Soviets. We call it the KGB, but then it was the NKVD or the GPU. And one of the things you often find is that people often develop great admiration for their enemies. It's one of those kind of odd things. I mean, you can see this in people who are combat veterans. I mean, some of the few people in the world who can understand what you went through were the guys on the other side.
Yeah.
All right. You are all, that's one of those things that even though you're fighting each other, it's a kind of bond that you share that no one else actually shares. And so you can develop admiration. You can even develop an affection. And in Philby's case, he seems to have come to the conclusion that the British intelligence service were kind of second rate and that the Soviets were very good. And when they offered it to work for them, it was too much of an ego stroke to ignore.
Mm-hmm.
See, that brings in this other element that always tends to fly around, ego. This idea again of having secrets that no one else has, of being able to deceive people, of being the only person in a room who knows something. It's a heady type of thing. I think in some ways it's its own sort of drug. And that's certainly something I think that played in Crowley's part. And the other thing about it is that even though he clearly screwed up seriously on a couple of occasions. There was something that he did in Italy in 1922, which included, by the way, leaving intelligence documents around in Sicily for the Italians to find. That was a big mistake that really set him cast into the wilderness for some time. So the type of thing, again, is that Crowley isn't an intelligence officer. He's not a career spy. That's not all he does. It's a kind of part-time job in which he is employed as people higher up see him as useful and see him as reliable. Crowley, in his magical career, in his esoteric or occult career, is constantly trying to win the favor and approval of these beings he calls the secret chiefs. Now, this is his whole idea that there are beings, there are gods and angels and devils out there. There are these beings that you can access and that you can gain power. And that's what he spends his whole life trying to do with his, he would admit, little success. And it was a huge frustration for him. And I think it's one of those things that, again, he sort of describes, early on, the secret chiefs, the ascended masters, whatever you want to call them, Iwas, whatever the names of the spirits, they sort of reached out and they reveal a little bit to you. It's a bit like having it revealed to you that there's this other world out there. Okay, yeah, we're here. But then you spend the rest of your life waiting for them to come back and tell you more, and they never do. That he never got the reward or the access to those higher spiritual powers that he wanted. So in some way, access and even occasional reward, those strokes he got from people in power in Britain, in the government, was a substitute for that. I mean, I think it was a way, in nothing else, that he could do something that he felt good about, and that he felt that he was doing something useful. It goes back again to this sort of impression that I was left with about him, which was, he was a guy with a wicked sense of humor in some ways, a man with, not a particularly good friend. Okay, had no business sense whatsoever, none. I haven't run across a single Thelemite who would ever claim that. Whatever else they say about him, everybody agrees that he was lousy with money. Mm-hmm. And in terms of his personal relationships, well, some people claim that every woman he became connected with went mad. I think he tended to be attracted to women who were probably pretty much on the road to the loony bin to begin with. Mm-hmm. But I don't think their relationship with him helped them at all. He was abusive, mostly, I think, more psychologically than physically. But he would have been a terrible person to live with. I can't.
Is this why celebrities and rock stars try to emulate him so much, or look to him?
Well, I think that the sort of admiration that came about him in the counterculture '60s is that he was sort of picked up as this symbol of anti-establishment. He seemed to stand for all sorts of things. What could you connect with him? Free love and drugs. There you go.
He's like,
and by the way,
Wilhelm Reich figure or something. Yeah.
Yes, and Crowley really did love his drugs. He was a pioneer in recreational drugs. In many ways, coke, mescaline.
But my point is, people like Timothy Leary, supposedly is a counterculture figure, But
Yeah.
like Crowley, people who've done research found him, he was an asset, an intelligence asset,
He's got-
pushing drugs.
yeah.
And there,
Right.
then he's referring to Crowley. There's the 60s were this age of Crowley. And how he says he would have loved to. He even said that Crowley would have too bad he didn't live to see the 60s. That's what Leary said. But I'm saying the point is we have this sort of a consistency thing where you have these assets, these counterculture figures. A lot of people have done the assets. A lot of the counterculture, if not created, was manipulated by the intelligence agencies, and largely kind of through we get a kind of a glimpse of how this might be done, because this is how the intelligence agencies, why they're interested in like the occult, which is the arts and the idea of sleight of hand and manipulation, these things, getting into Hollywood and getting into the entertainment industry, and these things having such a vast influence via mass communication, which really came on board after Crowley's death in the 50s with television, but with radio too. But we now know that with Operation Mockingbird and MK Ultra, and we see
MK Ultra.
We see hints of MK Ultra in Crowley's life, don't we?
Well, you could argue, and I think this is maybe going too far, but that he's a kind of pioneer of that.
Yeah.
I mean, here's one of the things that Crowley would do, and he would take notes on. This is kind of Crowley the scholar. One of the drugs that he was very interested in, and in fact, when he's in the U.S. during World War I, he goes up to the Park Davis lab in Detroit, which manufactured this, because you could just go up to the rack and you could buy an entire bag of mescaline. All right, because Park Davis had figured out how to synthesize the active ingredients essentially in peyote.
Yeah.
They weren't quite sure what they were going to do with it yet. But nevertheless, they had this stuff. So, he goes on this road trip and he goes up and he just sort of buys a bunch of it and then just, and goes on magical retreats and, has sex in the the redwoods on mescaline, which all sounds like a lot of fun. But the other thing that he did with it is that he would invite people over for dinner. And he would usually fix them some sort of spicy meal, like a curry. Apparently, he fixed a mean curry. And then he would record how much mescaline he put in the curry, or in some cases, how much he put into each person's portion. He wouldn't take any himself on those occasions, and he would then sit back and watch and record the actions and reactions of his guests. He was using them as guinea pigs to test dosages and effects of a psychoactive drug. Now, here's the interesting question. What were those notes for? Was he just doing this for his own amusement, or was it because he could already see possibly that there was potential in this? The thing that MK Ultra, the CIA through MK Ultra were really the pioneers with LSD. Mm-hmm. And what they saw in LSD was what they saw in other potential drugs. And then it comes back to this whole thing that's pretty familiar with us today, enhanced interrogation techniques. Mm-hmm. Is there a way, are these chemicals that can allow us to sort of control, manipulate the architecture of the human mind? That's what they want to do. It's not even really so much, interrogation is just a means, is just a way of getting into the real question of what, for better or for worse, we like to call mind control. So can you take someone and can you control this person? And can that drug assist you in doing it? One of the other things that Crowley sort of combined his interest in drugs with was a very avid interest and a great deal of skill in hypnotism. And in fact, when I was working on the book, I was actually talking about it. I was having a conversation similar to this. I was sort of going through the whole Aleister Crowley thing of explaining why I was interested. And I was talking to a guy who was one of those retired intelligence people that I mentioned previously. Mm-hmm. And no, I'm not going to mention his name. But he had spent something like 25, 30 years in the service and, had been in operations. And so, those are the things that he wouldn't talk about. But I'm describing Crowley to him, and he goes, he sort of interviews me, and he goes, hypnotism. This guy's just a hypnotist. Everything he does is related to hypnotism. And I said, ask for more of an explanation. He goes, well, look, it's the whole thing in occultism. What's the whole point of rituals and chants and the rest of this? That's all either auto-hypnosis or it's group hypnosis. What goes on in these things is that Crowley simply developed different means to hypnotize people. And rituals are a way of doing that. The drugs were another way of doing it. But that's what all of his stuff is. And, again, I think that's maybe oversimplifying it a bit. But on the other hand, when he said that there was a click, And I think that is one of those things that Crowley was continually exploiting, and his ability, it comes down to this question: if your powers as a hypnotist are good enough, and let's say that you were sitting at a meeting of the German propaganda cabinet in New York, and you were able to gain the other people's attention, to what degree are you influencing them by arguments, and to what degree, without their knowledge, are you hypnotizing them? Okay, it's not impossible. So that's another one of those skills that not everybody has, and it's one of those skills that British intelligence would think, well, maybe there's some case we should send in Crowley. He has unusual powers of influence over certain people.
It's the same way the intelligence agencies would use, in the past, magicians, but also even actors and actresses, and even journalists and these things. They can go to places and they can gain influence and push a certain meme or get information, and then serve their function. It's you get a more direct example of Mockingbird, where the CIA has these journalists that are on the payroll that are pushing stories or that are favorable to the agency, or to, presumably the United States, the West, whatever. But you still have an example again where not exactly agents, but assets, people who are, because you got to think in concentric circles of the agencies. The agencies represent certain interests, and those interests are usually corporate, financial, the elite, and they're the ones that created the situations that create the justification for the actual creation of these agencies. The CIA is a good example of that. Right after World War II, it goes out of OSS and these things, but the OSS have been operating kind of unofficially, at least the people, at least as far back as the mid 30s. And this also involved the opium trade and these things, which ties back to an old trade, and that's the clipper ships and Skull and Bones, and and even the British Empire, and these things. So these interests, I think what happened was in the 20th century, these relationships became formalized in these intelligence agencies, and like the CIA, something. It's sort of a consummation of sort of an untoward relation that's been going on for decades.
There have always been private intelligence agencies. That's one of the things. We tend to think of intelligence as being unique to state control, but that's never been the case. Any kind of large corporation has some kind of, if you control any kind of technological assets that your competition could steal, then you better have some kind of corporate counterintelligence service, and you better have a corporate intelligence service to steal the secrets that your opponents have. Everybody has to, and there's a continual. If you look at one of the things today, is that it's surprising to the degree to which, let's say, the CIA, the NSA, others, Transportation Safety Board uses independent intelligence contractors.
Oh yeah, now.
All right.
Yeah.
These are generally people who have worked for one of the agencies, one of the military or one of the civilian intelligence agencies, and then go back to the so-called private sector and then create intelligence contractors that then get contract work from the very agencies they worked for previously. It's another example, what's been called the kind of revolving door of people going from the military into then the weapons and munitions industry and back and forth. The other thing, we can talk about, hypnotism, stage magic. Crowley was also very interested and is at least supposed by some people to known about stage magic himself. It's one of those things that he would see. One of the things that Crowley understood about magic, or magic, if that magic with a K, the distinction between magic with a C, he would argue, was the stuff that it's a trick, which is performed. Magic with a K is the real thing. And, stage magic is a kind of imitation of the real thing. Mm-hmm. But the thing about it is that stage magic, the trick, is much easier than the real thing. And the reason why the trick is easier isn't that the trick is necessarily simple or easy to master, but the trick can be mastered, and once you have mastered it, it works every time. Once a magician has learned his tricks, they always work. On the other hand, if you're dealing with magic with a K, if you're trying to summon the aid, I don't know, of Beelzebub or something, well, then it gets tricky because you're not dealing with a trick. You're dealing with some kind of sentient being that can either cooperate or not cooperate. See? It's just like dealing with a person, only, magic, I suppose. And that is uncontrollable. You can't really control those things entirely. I mean, you never know. It's the whole, don't call up what you can't put down, that type of thing.
Yeah.
You can summon something, but then whether you're going to get it to do exactly what you want, well, and that's where the trick is simply easier. So that's why he was often the simplest way to do it. That's the whole reason why stage magic came about, is that it was a simpler thing to do, and most people were convinced by it. And you didn't have any like demons hanging around your house later on. So the other thing, though, which is worth keeping in mind, is another reason why an intelligence agency would be interested in someone like Crowley is in the possibility, just the possibility, that magic with a K stuff actually works. Yeah, you got to think about what that would mean.
Yeah, like remote viewing or something.
Yeah, remote viewing. Well, and they still go after that. It's they kind of pretend that they don't, but yes, it's the men that stare at goats. Why are they staring at goats? I don't know. If I look at this goat really hard, can I kill it? Okay, that's what they're trying. They're trying to, will something to die, and think of then how you would be. In fact, there was a guy who. He was an ex-Thelemite. He had been sort of a follower of Crowley's ideas and had virtually drifted away from those. He was very knowledgeable about them, and I sort of appreciated his help when I was working on the book, because he could help me make sense out of things that, from an outsider's view, didn't make sense with. But he was really fascinated by this idea that one of the things that Crowley was involved in, or that other people were trying to involve himself in, was what he called the weaponization of magic. And again, it would be something that would occur to, someone have an idea that, well, okay, if, what about something like, I don't know, a death spell? What if you could actually get that to work? What if you could remotely will someone to die? Now, think about it. Again, that would be a mean thing to do, but just imagine the practical, political, and intelligence implications of that power. Assassination with no fingerprints. That you could simply eliminate your enemies almost magically, because literally you were eliminating them magically. Now, you could argue that might seem to be silly, but might it be worth exploring that? And if you were going to explore it, who could be your guide there? Well, someone who knows about it, and a guy like Aleister Crowley would be the one to do it. I don't know, could you summon Bartzabel, the spirit of war, to assist you in your current struggle so that your opponents don't? What kind of sacrifices might you need to offer them? I don't know, a boatload of innocent people? Okay, now you can, you can make some pretty good graphic novel type scenes in this.
This is an old story. Didn't John Dee supposedly conjure up the tempest that destroyed the Spanish fleet in 1588?
I think later on he gets the credit for that, whether he ever claimed it or not. But that was one of the things that people would like to attach to him, or that some would claim to it. But the mere possibility that those things, whether it's simply mind reading, telekinesis, okay, and if you could hone that skill, if you could figure it out, teach it, apply it, find the people who have it, whatever, that would give you a tremendous ability. You still there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, okay, yeah, the noise and stuff. It's sort of and by the way, there were other people working on this at the same time. In the 20s and the 30s, for instance, the Soviets had an entire section which was they were employing a particular guy by the name of Alexander Barchenko. And Barchenko was, he'd been an esoteric Freemason or Rosicrucian. Remember, he also wrote sci-fi, early on around World War I. And then he became kind of, the what you could call the KGB's early doctor of the occult. And he was very interested in everything from ancient civilizations to what we would now call UFOs. Yes, we had to work those in somewhere.
So now he'd be employed by the History Channel, right?
Now he'd be Barchenko would be on the History Channel, and he would lead these expeditions to the Arctic. He would let his hair grow, and then comb it straight up. So, remember, the higher the hair, the closer to aliens, I guess. But anyway, but he was also very interested in. He actually developed this kind of psi amplification helmet. Now, this is like in 1925, and it was this helmet that people were supposed to wear that would amplify their psychic powers. All right, and one of the things, and he was trying to sell the Soviet intelligence on it, and the idea that this could then be supplied to their agents, and it could allow them to telepathically communicate with each other around the world. Now, again, think of the practical advantages for intelligence work. No more codes, no more one-time pads, nothing that could be compromised, just direct brain-to-brain communication from one agent to another. And it's the type of thing that, from a purely practical standpoint, someone's going to explore. Someone is going to, whether or not, a lot of time doing it, and that was another one of these things in where Crowley was the kind of go-to guy. There's a case, which I think I mentioned in the book, in the late 20s, when he's kind of in the wilderness. That's sort of Crowley's wilderness years, because he screwed up in Sicily, and he left documents around. And nobody back in London wants to talk to him, but I think it's in the late 20s, there's this question about a variety of intrigues in the Far East. Some of them involve this Russian painter who was a Soviet agent named Nikolai Rerik, and essentially they were trying to figure out what it was the Russians were doing in Tibet and what the Japanese were up to in Manchuria. And there's a fellow, an intelligence agent, who ran across, and the other guy in intelligence who knew Crowley, who says, well, I kind of hate to bring his name up, but maybe the person who seems to know this type of thing, if you want to get somebody who has the information that could help, you should probably talk to Aleister Crowley.
Yeah.
And again, he almost is like, I know you probably don't want to hear that name, but that was an interesting indication, because it showed, on the one hand, how he was kind of a pariah. You have to sort of apologize by even mentioning him. But hey, guys, this is the guy, this is the man who can actually help us. And so you should just hold your nose and appeal to him.
Yeah, this is like years later. There was that the First Earth Battalion that is written about in Men in Starred Goats, I guess. Yeah, it's a similar thing, I guess, where they're trying to set up some sort of weird, esoteric, occult way of manipulating people, new type of warfare. Yeah. Well,
there are all of these stories. Most of them, show up in everything from Hellboy. Again, it's one of these things that sort of finds its way into popular culture. And one of those ideas is this concept of some sort of intelligence occult bureau. That there's some sort of branch of intelligence which actually studies and uses these things. And part of the reason why that idea exists is that, one, it provides a lot of, potential action, and it's kind of interesting. But the other is that at the bottom of it, again, I'd argue, it just makes a certain amount of sense. Okay. You have to figure is that, if somebody never experimented with that, certainly they weren't doing their job if they hadn't in some way.
Yeah.
And it's, truly, if you can look around, I've never been able to find convincing evidence that anybody was actually running a special occult bureau. But then you wouldn't, would you?
No, you wouldn't.
You wouldn't expect that to be that, because that's going to be the Daffodil Club somewhere. Mm-hmm. It's not, nobody's going to put up a thing, occult bureau, or MI13. I think you'd be more original. Yeah. Or maybe you wouldn't. Maybe you'd name it MI13 because no one would believe that you would name it MI13. Never underestimate the amount of twisted logic that goes into these things.
Yeah, at the end of the day, you're also spending other people's money. So
yes, okay.
Why not?
Okay. As long as you can get the Treasury to appropriate things for you, you'll just go on because that's what they're good at. Bureaucracy spend money.
And it's one thing. Another thing. A lot of these alchemists have always. Yeah, these alchemists have always been con men in many respects, right? Promising whether it's wealth from nothing, turning base metal into gold, thereby making gold base in the final analysis. But the idea that that they could sell, the court magician could sell some sort of trick to Queen Elizabeth, or to get some sort of advantage in these things. Well, why not explore it? Yes, and
why?
This is also in the age of wireless, right? I mean, the early days of wireless communication. So perhaps they're trying to, maybe there's, I can understand having some sort of, well, maybe there is some way we could communicate the brain to brain to brain. Why not? If machine to machine can communicate wirelessly, why not brain to brain?
Right.
And look at today with cell phones and this stuff, all this data going through the ether, and what we're talking about right now. This would appear to be magical to someone from Crowley's generation, I guess.
It is kind of magical, isn't it? Okay. I mean, I kind of understand how, television signals work, but still, at some level, I don't understand how television signals work. This stuff just goes through the air, and it kind of goes to, the other thing you have to wonder about is, what is all of this data constantly going through your body doing to you?
Yeah, that's
because we're going to find out at some point. Maybe the next generation will, but remember, 100 years ago, people didn't have that. They, the amount of electromagnetic energy in the environment was non-existent. Now we're just swimming in this stuff all the time, and I think it will be very interesting to see what the. But it's this sending, it's this kind of encoding of information, and really, on a certain basic level, one mind ought to be able to communicate with another one. I mean, it's a big battery, right? Wet battery. It has electrochemical charges taking place. There's energy which is going through there. So it should just be, that's why, Barchenko's idea, the Russian I was talking about, was you just needed an amplifier. You just needed to make those signals stronger.
What do you think brain mapping is all about? Do you think that's for medical? No, that's to, brain mapping is probably being weaponized to the extent that they can do it. And every thought has electrical current that you can chart. And theoretically, if you map the brain and watch the brain, you could theoretically read people's minds.
Yes,
right. So,
and dare I bring up those terms again? Mind control.
Yeah.
Figure out how the mind works. It's decode it, and then you can control it, or at least you can have much greater control over it than you could.
Yeah, and if you have sort of a radical. If you have sort of a radical materialist nationalist view of things, you think everything is just biochemical anyway. And so it is subject to manipulation and change. You can actually scientifically manipulate it in these things. But it's that's sort of that emptiness. I think that the emptiness of the British cosmology, which we see again, which, everything's just material. Therefore, everything's just a chemical reaction, and there's no theology or morality to the universe, and therefore all is permitted. And do what thou wilt, I guess, right?
Do what thou wilt is the whole of the law.
Yeah.
Which is one of those things, which is one of the things, I'll kind of, this is going to kind of sound like a plug, which I guess it is, but I'll throw it out. One of the things that I am currently working on is a 24 episode, what I guess will be either an audio or podcast series on secret societies.
Oh, okay.
I'm working on that for a thing called the Great Courses, which some of the people who listen to this may have heard of. They offer courses and all kinds of things.
Yeah, it's a CD thing. Yeah.
And they're I think CDs have they're looking for new platforms to do it, and this is one of the things. And so the idea was sort of coming out with the topics and then, writing these sort of half-hour, which was really interesting, but it's really kind of, putting all of these things together. But here's what I noticed is the degree to which the things that keep coming up over again and again and again. And one of them is this, you've got Crowley's do what thou wilt, but then you can go back to the Middle Ages and you can find the assassins. The supposedly terrorist group that was nominally Islamic, but when you look deeper, really isn't. It's something else. And they, again, had this motto, which was basically, nothing is true, everything is permitted. It's one of the things, another way it was put was, believe nothing, do everything. And if you look at that, it's just stating the same thing in the same way. And it's one of these, the term that all of this, and I see it again and again, in these various occult groups and secret societies. It becomes, even in Weishauft's Bavarian Illuminati, there's the simple idea that there is no fundamental morality to this. There is just sort of action and the results of those actions. Mm-hmm. But the term for it is a rather long one. Is antinomianism. So anytime you encounter this type of thing, an antinomianism is simply the idea that there are no rules. There are no rules, or and to the degree that there are rules, they are false. And that the way in which you achieve true spiritual liberation is to disobey all rules. Now, again, you can find that where? In the do-your-own-thing philosophy, again, of the counterculture in the 60s. All right? Yep. Rules are artificial. Rules are to be ignored. You essentially decide what is right and wrong. And that's one of those things that is like a leitmotif, or if you want to think of it another way, it is like a persistent stain that you find from the ancient mystery cults of Greece and Rome right up until esoteric societies of the 20th and 21st century. And it's something that Crowley himself was very much a part of.
Yeah, he even said that you shall be like gods or everyone is a star, right?
Yeah. Well, which is, which fits in with the old, you're talking about alchemists. The ultimate work of alchemy wasn't turning base metals into gold. That was a parlor trick. The ultimate work in alchemy is to transform the human being into something which is beyond human.
Which gets back to Gnosticism, I guess.
Yeah. It's essentially to become God. Mm-hmm. Which then goes back to the, I think most people are, familiar with the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, whether it's an allegoric or whatever. So they got the two trees. They got the tree of knowledge, which they get a taste of, and that apparently tips them off to the fact that there are other things that they should be doing. And then there's this thing called the tree of life. And if you go back and read through Genesis, you'll see that God or the gods, because, I don't know, they're talking to each other in a plural. I don't know. No one's ever explained that to me. But that's a theological question we won't get into. But nonetheless, when they realize that these creations, these kind of glorified pets they've put in this terrarium called Eden, could now eat of this tree of life, and the fear is if they eat of it, they will become immortal and they will become like us. And that's why they're expelled, because they cannot become like us. Now, that can be interpreted in all sorts of ways, and the way that has often been interpreted in alchemy and other occult doctrines is that whether it's, literally an apple or a tree or whatever it might be, it means that they were on the cusp of achieving a knowledge of themselves which would have made them equal to God, which would have made them masters of their own fate. Since that could not be permitted, they were expelled and kept in ignorance. So the great work, the kind of fundamental work that runs through most occultism, is the idea of achieving that knowledge that was denied to Adam in Eden. To basically get the thing that was stolen from you at the beginning, and thereby to achieve your full potential. Now, if you take that, then, all kinds of interesting things happen. The serpent becomes a good guy, for instance. Okay.
This is like process theology or something.
Yeah. Well, it's you just find it again and again and again. I mean, they'll sort of change it around in one form or another, but it's basically just this constant quest to achieve, and again, and what it boils down to in many respects is immortality. I mean, look at the tech wizards today. Look at this whole idea about life extension and singularity, the idea of meld. I mean, the whole reason why you want to meld humans with computers is because you want to live forever. That's what it's about. That would be, if one could do that, if one could transfer human consciousness into a machine, which theoretically could be kept running forever, then in a sense, one would have achieved immortality. The great quest. It's essentially alchemical. Mm-hmm. It's essentially a magic type of thing. And that's one of the things, again, it gets a little weird and occasionally a bit disturbing and creepy, but it's one of the things to look, these things that appear to be sort of scientific investigations, the quest for, mind-machine melding is both a technical problem, is also a kind of existential and metaphysical problem, all at the same time.
Yeah. But, yeah. What you really get is at least with the Kabbalah and all, you get the Golem or Frankenstein, right? I mean,
yeah, okay,
yeah.
Again, the creation of artificial intelligence. Yeah. That's what the Golem is an artificial intelligence.
And that's what we see, with whether with Google or this attempt to sort of to monopolize all information and these things, and then somehow to feed it into a system where again. You'll get interactive technology while you're getting the implant thing, right? The an implant or a direct connection to the internet and these things that they're trying to. They've already gotten people addicted to just with the devices, but I'm not sure. I'm sure not too far off is a device that will, full interaction. Where with your brain.
just have you've already got microchips for dogs, and you could have microchips for people if you wanted them to tell you where you are. So it's just it's an incremental process. But that's basically what's being aimed for. Yeah,
we've had movies about like a drug that makes you super smart. On the cheap, more or less. And a lot of people sold LSD as a way to attain some sort of spiritual wisdom. Without contemplation and the hard work that it takes really to gain wisdom, and which is usually life experience and these things. But you can just take a drug and have an experience and attain some sort of wisdom.
Just go on a trip and you come back and you're changed in some way. You've achieved enlightenment. Is this this thing that the people are looking for? But that's it's you were talking earlier about con men, and at a certain level, I think Crowley was kind of a con man. I think he had, he was what he had to be. Mm-hmm. And it comes back to, again, the fellow, the old retired intelligence guy I talked about who, thought that everything that Crowley did was related to hypnotism. That's essentially what he was arguing, is that this was all just a kind of trick. He was using hypnosis in order to make people see things or do things in order to control them. It's kind of a con. But then, as I have to admit that as I have gotten older and the more history that I've studied, I have basically come to the conclusion that pretty much everything is a con.
The received narratives are not the truth. They're narratives.
Most of what passes for history isn't. Right? It's either deliberately distorted, because the real stuff is very difficult to get to. And it's this, there's often this assumption is that if you just collect enough information, then everything will become apparent. All questions will be answered. And that's not really the way that it works, because the more information you collect, in some cases, the picture doesn't become clear. You start out with a pretty simple idea. Again, it's like I said, you start out writing a book, you have a kind of naive idea what this person is like. The more information you collect on them, you realize that idea just doesn't really conform to what this person was at all. And in the end, you end up, I'd have to say in all the subjects I've worked with, I didn't really end up liking them, but I ended up sort of feeling sorry for them in some way.
Yeah, it's they're caricatures that someone has drawn for a reason.
Yeah.
And,
well, that really came out in another, to just draw attention to another book, the book on Sidney Reilly, who's became interested in because he's accused of being everything from a role model for James Bond to the ace of spies. And the thing is that virtually nothing that was written about him was true. The real guy is not anything like this whole thing that was, and I realized that was kind of and I would say, I will freely admit that the flaw in my book, Trust No One, was that I did not reject everything, that I still clung to the idea that certain basic assertions about him were true, and that I should have questioned those further. And I have learned since that they are not. That there essentially that there, and it wasn't accidental. There was a decades-long elaborate system of manufacturing a whole persona for this person that bore no relation to the actual man.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you that. What was the purpose for that deception? What do you think? Was it like, I don't think it's a coincidence that James Bond movies came out just after the Cambridge 5 case exploded.
Yes,
all the homosexuality was exposed.
You are absolutely right. One of the things, that MI6, SIS, British intelligence, took a huge black eye in the 50s and early 60s when first Burgess and McLean defect. You got two spies within you, and then Philby, years later is another one of them. And then eventually you find out that there's Blunt, and then there's Cairn Cross, and it's not just 5, maybe it's 7, maybe it's 9, maybe it's 12. Nobody knows. Okay. Mm-hmm. The point is that British intelligence was riddled with Soviet spies. It was a leaky ship. So how do you recover from that? Well, you look around and you try to find, here we've got Ian Fleming's written these whole series of potboiler novels about this glamorous British spy. And that's when they start coming out. And yes, I think you are absolutely right that while they didn't necessarily promote it or plan it, MI6 was very, very happy and very, very supportive of the whole James Bond narrative because that gave them a respectable, sexy image as opposed to the leaky ship one that they actually had.
And I guess I would say unequivocally masculine heterosexual figure.
Yes. Okay. Yes. None of this stuff. What you. But and so that's that certainly is a connection to it, and I think that has something to do with that's part of it. The first book on Reilly that got popular was part of that whole thing. It came out in 1967, and again that's what started this whole idea that he's this kind of Bond-like figure, and it's just it's bunk, right?
And also that whole culture of secrecy. In the 60s, the popularization, first with Bond, even with Maxwell Smart, these movies, and like Flint, these movies, the glamorous, the legitimization of the cryptocracy, of secret agencies having no accountability, out there fighting some, chaos, or is it Schmersh, or is it, what's the other one in the Bond one, the bad guys in the Bond film, not Schmersh.
Spectre.
Spectre, right? And these things.
Spectre.
Yeah, this idea, so. Again, in the eyes of the public, these intelligence agencies, the cryptocracy, these black holes of all types of deceptive and weird black ops and these things is in a sense legitimized, and you have a whole subculture, a whole netherworld which there is no accountability.
It's cool and sexy, and they're fighting people who are evil, and therefore they have to do whatever. It's the whole thing of controlling the narrative. And that's why, for instance, and I can tell you in the work that I've done, in intelligence agencies are very, very interested in what anybody writes about them. They'll sometimes pretend that they're not, but they're always interested because it comes down to this idea of controlling the narrative about themselves. Mm-hmm. And it was I'll tell you a story. When I was working. When I was working on the Reilly book, one of the things that I got access to was his SIS, his MI6 file, which, as I explained to you, they gave me access to it because it gave them access to what I was writing. But I had to go into a room. It was in London. It was a room, it was a relatively modest room and a nondescript, it was not in MI6 headquarters, not anywhere near there. It was in some small office building. And there was some retired guy who sat the entire day while I went through this, just sitting across the table from me. He was my watcher. He was there, I suppose, to make sure I wasn't going to carry this on. He was incredibly bored. And every now and then I could get him to talk about things, but not that much. But what they had there is I was basically in this library, and it was a library in which I noticed the walls were all full of books and articles about British intelligence. All right. So I started looking through it, and I realized some, and then I came across a section where there were my books and articles. There they were, right on the shelf. And so, I could sort of pull them off and look at them, and I realized that all of them had been gone through, and they were highlighted, and there were like different colors of highlighter in them. I don't know what that meant. But someone, so I was kind of gratified because it meant that somebody had actually read this. But it was, on the other hand, it was kind of creepy because you realize that you're sitting in this room, in this library, in which they've collected all the stuff where anybody's ever written about them, and they've sort of gone through for what has been said. And I think, by the way, it's entirely sensible that they would want to control the narrative. I mean, any company wants, Walmart doesn't want people writing bad stuff about Walmart. If they could prevent it, they could. If they could come up with a counter narrative. But there's always this battle to try to shape perception. And that battle, by the way, has nothing to do with the truth, usually. It just has to do with whatever sort of, James Bond is not an accurate picture of modern intelligence work. Okay, anybody in intelligence would agree with that. But nevertheless, it's very popular, and it's sexy, and it's attractive, and it's one of those things that distracts attention from other things as well. It's a part of. We live in a constant atmosphere of information, but much of that information is designed to misdirect and deceive. Yeah. It's this term. It's a term that comes up, disinformation, as opposed to misinformation. So misinformation is information that's just wrong. Okay, it's wrong, but disinformation is deliberately misleading. That is, the purpose of disinformation isn't simply to give you something which is false, but the best way to put it, the purpose of disinformation is to lead the hounds away from the fox, to always direct them in some way that they're not going to find what it is that they're looking for, to leave false leads, false clues, that would lead them in that direction. And much of what, this whole current debate about false news is really a debate about competing forms of disinformation. Mm-hmm. But that is, and again, to sort of bring this back to Crowley, that was something I think that Crowley understood quite well, that it was always a bad. See, one of the problems that he came up with is that by the end of the 1920s, his reputation had become so thoroughly besmirched, largely because of the kind of, bad boy, devil-worshipping role that he kind of willingly accepted. This is, when he was first called the wickedest man in the world, he took a certain perverse pride in that. But what he began to realize by the early 30s, when he's now moved back to Britain, I mean, he's sort of allowed to come back to Britain, after I think, intelligence-related stints in France and then in Germany, interestingly enough, around the time that Hitler is rising, comes back to Britain, and he actually launches this campaign. He does have friends. He has friends in the press, for instance, and this, again, is discussed in the book. And he goes on this kind of charm offensive. He wants to try to restore his reputation. And he knows that one of the things that would help restore his reputation is that if he could really say what he was doing during the First War. Mm-hmm. And in one of the libel cases against him, he tries to introduce that. He actually mentions, he's sort of pressed on it, and he mentions the name of a man called Commander Guy Gaunt. And he basically says that Gaunt could vouch for everything that I'm telling you. Now, the interesting thing about that is that Gaunt didn't show up to vouch for him because Gaunt couldn't do that. But Gaunt was the representative of British naval intelligence in New York when Crowley was there. I mean, he named the right guy. That again, I mean, it certainly tells me something that Crowley knew who the chief of British naval intelligence was in World War I New York, which if he had nothing to do with it, he wouldn't have known. Yeah. But he knew who it was, and that's because that's who he'd worked with. But, hanging over Crowley's head is the thing that keeps all former assets and spies in line. In the British case, it's the Official Secrets Act. And he knew at some point it had been clearly impressed upon him that he needed to keep his mouth shut, and you never, ever talk about what you did unless you're given permission to talk about it. And so he would come close. In fact, there's a guy who's done an interesting thing of sort of looking that whenever Crowley would sort of make these statements in which it looked like he might start to talk about something, bad stuff surfaced about him in the press. And it's interesting because that's not an accident. Anytime Crowley looked like he might possibly start to shoot his mouth off, someone in the British tabloid press, and that was still around very much then, would sort of dredge up his treasonous activity during the First World War, dredge up his horrible behavior, dredge up his supposed involvement in child sacrifice, anything they could come up with. And as soon as he backed off, that would go away. And that was their way of controlling him. And part of it was saying that, look, this is the kind of image that's been created for you. And what he eventually realized is that this was the image he was stuck with. And that there was no going back. That the role that he had played, arguably, ended up playing him.
Yeah.
Or another way to think about it, it's like an actor who becomes so identified with a particular role that no one will accept them as anything else.
Yeah, he's Mr. Spock.
You're Mr. Spock forever. No matter you're Captain Kirk. No matter how much you want to be T.J. Hooker, you're still Captain Kirk. Okay.
But nevertheless, what you point out is, despite having no means of support or income, he's taken care of, which is indicative of
somebody. There were sort of people in the shadows who paid his bills. I mean, in 1934, he's brought into court and he becomes an undischarged bankrupt, which means he has no assets, he has no money. So that's it. He lives until 47. So nevertheless, in the interval, he never lacks for a place to live. He never lacks for some degree of money. I mean, he doesn't have a lot of money, but, he's eating. And, of course, he never lacks for his weekly package of heroin, right? Mm-hmm. Because he's also a hopeless heroin addict by this time, which, oddly enough, this is one of the ironies, he becomes a heroin addict not because he uses it recreationally. Apparently, he saw no particular sort of therapeutic or esoteric value in heroin, but it was prescribed to him as a treatment for asthma. Which I found surprising. But yes, that was one of the things that heroin and other opiates were used for. And he suffered from asthma from the time he was a child. And this was before they had inhalers. So one of the things was, give your kid some heroin, and that will, and it apparently worked. But the thing is that you become and he would try to, he would kick it, and then he would go back and forth. And so he was still a stone junkie, on the day he died. Probably taking enough daily to kill 2 or 3 other people. But that was simply the tolerance that he had broken up during the year. But in a way, it's kind of similar to this reputation he acquired. His heroin addiction wasn't something he acquired, because he was having fun with it. It was just one of those sort of, dare I say, it was a cross that he had to bear. There you go. and partly one he sort of... he kind of invented for himself, I suppose. So that's why in the end he struck me as, a fascinating guy. And I couldn't help but feeling that in most ways, a bit like, Reilly and others, that he's been sort of grossly misunderstood. Not necessarily that he's been misunderstood, that he was a big pussycat as opposed to someone who was, had negative, but that even his negative aspects had been misunderstood. And the other thing that, I said sort of felt sorry for him is that I could kind of see that, what eventually comes across in people is just their sort of humanness. And it's one of those things that, again, for anyone who ever is going to try to look at a biographical study, or any people you look at, you got to remember, at bottom, these people are human beings. They're flawed. They have fears. They have insecurities. They sometimes make very bad decisions. They don't have the luxury of superheroes or fictional characters. And those bad decisions have consequences. And those consequences can end up with, heroin addiction. They can end up being considered the wickedest man in the world. They can end up, never achieving the goals that you thought you might have wanted to do. And it was, in death, Aleister Crowley has achieved much greater influence and fame than he ever did when he was alive. And I guess, it would be interesting to see what he would think of that. I'm not going to get a Ouija board and find out. But because, among other things, he had a very low opinion of Ouija boards. But it's, he was this kind of fascinating, sort of maddening, in some ways, part seer, part charlatan, but a guy in the end who, was sort of stuck with the choices he had made. And one of those choices he had made on and off was to spy for his country. And spying for his country meant that he had to deceive and betray people, because that's what you end up doing. That's inevitably what what it involves is betrayal. And it seems to me then it's kind of odd why one should be shocked that when people within your organization, like Kim Philby, do what it is that essentially have been trained to do, which is to betray, except they turn that betrayal against you. The one thing I would say for Crowley, at least in terms of his intelligence work, I can't see any evidence he ever did that. I mean, he seems to have remained loyal to England. He was kind of called back into service at the beginning of World War II, again, by the head of naval intelligence, who basically, that again was an interesting clue. I think it's also detailed in the book, but, a clue in this sense. War breaks out. He sort of gets a little request to come see the head of naval intelligence, which is a guy named Admiral Godfrey. And by the way, Godfrey's secretary was Ian Fleming. So it's a connection there. And then Crowley is told he's given a number to call at the Admiralty. He's given a name. I think it's something like Captain Lang, and he's given a number to call. And so one of the interesting things there was, this is a number. This is a kind of, to some department. But the question is, what department was it? Well, turns out I had a friend in London who had a friend. And this friend of the friend was very, very interested in collecting things like intelligence phone numbers. Okay. So like figuring out, and particularly in the World War II period, what all of these different extensions went to. And it turns out he knew what this extension went to. He could identify what it was that Crowley was told to contact. And the office he was told to contact was the one that dealt with the interrogation of prisoners of war.
I'm thinking...
And that...
I knew you'd get it. Yeah.
All right. And remember, this was a guy who in the last war had done things like do dosage experiments with mescaline.
Yeah.
And then that gets, that brings you into things like Rudolf Hess.
Yes.
Who takes his seemingly bizarre flight to Britain, crashed, is taken prisoner. And what was it that Rudolf Hess, in captivity, accused his British captors of dosing him with? What he called Mexican brain poison, which somebody ought to have a band called that. But nevertheless,
cactus juice.
So yeah, cactus juice. So what's Mexican brain poison? Well, it turns out it's mescaline. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of interesting. Rudolf Hess, I don't know, crazy Rudolf, or maybe he wasn't so crazy, thinks the British are dosing him with mescaline to try to get secrets out of him. And this isn't long after Aleister Crowley, master of mescaline, had been approached by naval intelligence and the office dealing with interrogation of prisoners of war, which Hess is. And, does that prove that there's a connection? No, doesn't prove anything. But it suggests something. I mean, it's the type of thing that it was... One of the things my wife has asked me on more than one occasion when she sees me going through stuff where I try to give her these sort of long, this person met this person, did that. She goes, why weren't you a cop? Okay. What did you do in history? Why weren't you a cop? Because you're always suspicious of people. They always think there's connections between people. I go, well, there are. and so here's the way I would put it. A lot of what I do, Secret Agent 666, the book, and most of what else I do is essentially sort of historical detective work. Mm-hmm. So maybe I should have been a cop. I don't know. Never occurred to me for some reason, even though on one side of my family, oddly enough, they were all cops. But nevertheless, It is like that, and it's so what you do. I mean, in some cases, what I see my role in is that my role is to accumulate evidence and make a case. All right, here are the connections between these people, and at some point, I mean, again, this whole thing about Hess and brain poison and Crowley and mescaline, it would make me curious. I mean, it's one of those things where I look at that and I go, well, this isn't proof of anything, but is it suggestive of some connection? Yes, it is. Maybe I can't take it any further than that. But on the other hand, I can't ignore it, because that's often often in history, that's what you're left with, and because people do lie, and governments lie, and individuals lie, and things are covered up, and information is lost, and you have to kind of reconstruct these connections. And those, you can create trails of evidence that are very convincing. You can create trails of evidence that are merely suggestive, but they are there. And that's partly what I see my job. Part of what I see my job doing isn't trying to prove something absolutely to the exclusion of everything else, which is really a pretty hard thing to do with anything, but instead to explore what the evidence is and what possibilities that evidence presents. That, to me, is what history is really about, because it's about the evidence. It's not about some kind of absolute proof. Yeah, I'll point out, in fact, I enjoy pointing out to my students that there's this big difference between belief and knowing something. Mm-hmm. Most of what you think you know, you actually believe. And most of what you believe because someone told you to believe it. Not because you ever investigated it yourself, not because you ever critically examined it. You just believe it. And the example I like to use with them, for instance, you believe that the man your mother told you is your father is actually your father. Now, in most of your cases, that's true. Mom's telling you the truth, and your father is your father. But statistically, in a certain number of cases, it's not true. And you could say, well, yes, I could go have a DNA test, but have you had a DNA test to test your father? No, because you believe it. You believe it based upon what you were told, and you believe it based upon the fact that people tell you you look like him, or they tell you you have different. And again, that's probably right, but you don't know that. You believe it. Knowing is certainty. It is absolute certainty. Belief is simply a willingness to accept one explanation as opposed to other ones. And that's generally what we deal with. We're constantly dealing with beliefs as opposed to what it is that we know. And to me, really, that's what makes things interesting. That's what keeps it going.
And some explanations are more comfortable than others, so you pick the more comfortable one.
Yes, you accept the fact that dad is dad. You don't want to question that any further, even though you may have wondered about that nose on occasion as to where that came from. I think a lot of kids, I'm not sure I ever could, because I resemble there's usually some stage in childhood where there's this brief fantasy where you like to think that you're adopted and these people are not your parents. Okay. It usually occurs sometime around adolescence. Yeah. Okay. When, someone told you they aren't your parents, you'd be happy to know that. So it's always this kind of, in some ways, this kind of fear, and I don't know who was it said, it wasn't Crowley, but someone said there's a constant connection between the secret fear is also the secret wish. What you're afraid of, in some way, you're also sort of attracted to. It's this kind of, the simplest example of that is, death. Okay, people are afraid of death, but they're also constantly interested in it. Okay. It features in everything in some form or another, because it's this kind of thing that we really don't want to acknowledge, but yet we have to acknowledge, and so we do it in a whole variety of forms.
So, well, Richard, I want to thank you. I think we covered anything, and I think we covered it. You don't give too much away. There's the book. There's the book. Is packed full of evidence, and you build a very solid circumstantial case of Aleister Crowley being an asset of British intelligence. In fact, as you say in the book, the case you build has less evidence has sent men to the gallows.
Yeah. Well,
So-
it's circumstantial evidence. Things like fingerprints are usually superior to things like eyewitness testimony.
Yeah,
Most reliable stuff you have for people who are actually there. But yes, one of the things that someone who and again, there's a lot more in the book, and there's a lot more information in there. There's a lot more of the kind of connecting the dots. But it is a case, and again, I'd go back. Did Aleister Crowley have a relationship with British intelligence? Well, the MI document from 1918 pretty much demonstrates he did.
Mm-hmm.
What the book explores is what that was and how it extends both before and after 1918.
Yeah, and also explains the role of occultism, and so the nature of intelligence and the nature of not only intelligence assets and agents, but how they interact with each other.
Yeah,
and explains
a constant interaction between the two. I mean, this isn't something. It's just Aleister Crowley is not a one-off in the connection between an occultist and intelligence. This is something that, again, you mentioned John Dee, Queen Elizabeth Soothsayer, who also was a spy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, he was sent off. Her chief spy master, Sir Francis Walsingham, sent Dee and his buddy, his fellow occultist, Edward Kelly, off to Central Europe, supposedly on a kind of tour to meet other occultists. But really what they were doing was to spy on Catholic English emigres in Austria and France. It was a cover for an intelligence mission. So this is something that stretches back centuries. It has always been there.
Yeah, and from what I understand, he was always begging for more money too, much like Aleister Crowley.
Yes. Okay. You never have enough money. Okay. And it's another thing that sort of kept Crowley, in line, is that since he didn't have any other source of income, the kind of handouts that he got. And remember, someone's always giving him money.
Yeah.
It just kind of appears. That's. Some of it's coming from his followers, but most of them don't have a lot of money either. And then, the woman he has a child with in the 30s is connected to intelligence. Her paramour, this mysterious character I'd really like to learn more about called Robin Thine, is connected to. I mean, Crowley's, once he moves back to England, everyone around him has intelligence connections. Mm-hmm. And there's a reason for that. They're keeping an eye on him. They're not going to let him stray off the reservation. And the reason they're not going to do that is because he knows that the money and the heroin keep showing up.
Yeah. Keep him on a short leash.
Simple enough.
Yeah.
Keep him on a short leash.
So, okay, well, thank you, Doctor. That's Richard Spence, the author of Secret Agent 666, Aleister Crowley, British Intelligence and the Occult. Of course, also the author of Wall Street and the Russian Revolution, 1905 to 1925. Actually, that's his most recent book. And there's, of course, Trust No One, The Secret World of Sidney Reilly. And you guess this project regarding the Great Course series on secret societies, when is that?
That really won't go into production, I think, until next year.
Okay, that's very interesting.
So it's some ways off, but yes, it's sort of, I'm doing the writing now and going through all these things, but it's fun. It's I can't say that about everything that I write, but it has to be that. It has to keep you interested. It has to keep you. It has to keep you as the author wanting to know what happens next.
Yeah, I mean that's a whole other aspect of political science, which I think was completely missed in the college course, even high school courses. How our society functions, how are decisions made, what makes policy. The role of like organized crime and secret societies is a big part of that, and it's completely overlooked. And I think sort of another dispassionate analysis of how they relate to, our world, how laws are made, the relationships that they represent, the business relationships, and the outfits like Skull and Bones and these things. And
my approach to them is not to debunk things. Okay, I'm not trying to, and neither is it to try to promote anything. Mm-hmm. But really what I try to get down to is, okay, this is what we actually know about them.
Yeah.
All right. This is what you can actually sort of, I'll give you an example. An example might be, and this may or may not actually be in the series because I'm not supposed to talk about it too much, but, there are all people who claim that the Knights Templars in some way connected to the Freemasons. Okay? Lots of Freemasons believe that. Well, it's one of those things that when you actually try to look down in terms of any documentary evidence, there's no there. Okay. It's just this idea that seems to have become part of the kind of mythology that Freemasons in the 18th century invented to explain where they came from. And the most interesting thing about it is that nobody knows where they came from. That's the interesting thing, is that there's no particular point in time when something called Freemasonry appears here in this form. It develops sort of gradually and largely invisibly for about 300 years, and in the 18th century, all of these large lodges and grand lodges take off, but none of them invented anything. And the other thing is that Freemasonry means different things to different people. There was never an original one. There's never a pure one. So all sorts of people can claim to be Freemasons and can believe very, very different things. So that's one of the things that I'm trying to explore, is really just to show, in some ways, to show what we know, but also what we don't know. Mm-hmm. And that can be really interesting.
Yeah, because it is, at the very least, it's a at least from the British Empire's perspective. I mean, I think a lot of it became a mechanism or a technology for the British to sort of expand and maintain their empire through the lodge system, and also internally, just through communications, also through advancement in these things. It's a way to sort of operate sub rosa in these things, which then I think becomes a very crimogenic environment because it's secretive. So then you're off to the races. So.
Yeah.
So
hey, once you get like-minded people together and swear them to secrecy, then you can use them for all kinds of things.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
And so,
all right.
Well, listen, great. Listen,
well,
thank you for the long talk. It's great. I'll post this very soon. I'll send you the link.
Okay.
And perhaps, when later on we can talk. I don't know about the occult octopus, perhaps, or even as this develops with the secret societies. As after that comes out, maybe that'll be warranted discussion. So
okay,
great,
sure thing. All right, it's been a pleasure, and I hope your listeners enjoy it. And good night.
Thank you. Good night. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
still